Hey, so this event happened to me around last summer. It was probably the scariest story in my life, and I wanted to share it so that hopefully someone can learn from it. Something I've realized growing up, year by year, is that this world can be an amazing place, but it's also filled with some super sick people. And unfortunately, I've seen that side of our world firsthand. I'm a very social person, and I always love the opportunity to hang out with friends whenever possible. I'm also the type of person who is always looking for the next big thing. I guess I should tell you I was an 18-year-old male at the time of this story, and I have a decent-sized friend group of both boys and girls. And throughout high school, we had done a lot of crazy shit together. Being just out of high school, we wanted to do something insane together again before departing for college. And at that point, we all decided we'd like to go camping in the middle of nowhere for 3 days. Fun, right? And for some miracle, all of our parents thought it would be fine. So we had 6 people going. Me and my girlfriend Stephanie, my friend Brandon and his girlfriend Kaylee, and Steve and his girlfriend Sarah. We had decided to have 3 different tents for each couple, for reasons you can probably guess. Being a former Boy Scout, I was aware of everything we needed to survive for the 3 days. Food, water, and other essential supplies. Being rebellious teenagers, we also stocked up on plenty of booze and weed for our fun getaway. So mid-July, we depart for our camping vacation. After hours of driving down back roads, we eventually find a place that looks secluded, but not sketchy like some horror stories. There were houses nearby, but not too close. Again, we weren't looking for some sketchy woods to camp out in. But unfortunately, this area had no cell phone service. It took us at least an hour to get everything set up. While the girls and Steve finished setting up the camp, Brandon and I took a look around while fetching firewood. Eventually, we came across a cool-looking trail. We weren't too concerned because there was a house within a mile radius. We assumed that those people must use this trail to hunt. It was pretty big in this area. Or maybe animals used it. If you're wondering about our car, we drove a Honda Pilot, which was Steve's, that had plenty of room for us and our supplies. We parked the car rather close to the site, so we had eyes on it at all times. The first night, nothing much happened. We rolled a blunt, drank a bit, and called it a night. The next day, we decided to explore the woods a bit. Brandon and Kaylee stayed behind to watch the site and spend some quality time together. The rest of us decided to go down the path we had found earlier. Around 20 minutes down the path, Steve spotted a metal fence. We approached it to find a cemetery. The cemetery looked very old, but there were signs of activity there. Not some voodoo or occult-like stuff. Some flowers and notes left at the graves. Beyond the cemetery, we saw a bigger trail that had tire tracks and a half-assed parking lot for the area. We ventured down the path a bit more to spot some deer, then headed back because it was started to get late. That night we partied really hard because we had to leave the next day and didn't want to return with extra beer or weed. This night was the polar opposite of the other night. The other night was peaceful, and we had assumed this night would be the same as we all began to turn in. But boy were we fucking wrong. You would assume there would have been warning signs early in our trip, like a rusty knife on the path, or foot tracks around our site. But it wasn't like that at all. All of a sudden, we woke up to a blood-curdling scream coming from Steve and Sarah's tent, as we heard the fabric being ripped by what we assumed was something sharp. I guess Steve hit the man really hard with his flashlight and was able to get both himself and Sarah to his car. Here's the issue. Steve's tent is closest to the car, while the other 2 tents were closer to the trail. To get to Steve's car, we had to get past whatever had attacked Steve and Sarah. Luckily, all our drunken selves were gone, because before getting into his car, he yelled cemetery, and it clicked in my head. The trail on the other side of the cemetery. I quickly grabbed Brendan, Kaylee, and Stephanie and started running towards that trail. I used my phone flashlight to help us see. You might think, why would you turn your flashlight on? Well, the last thing I wanted was to completely miss the cemetery and be lost in the woods with whatever attacked Steve. By the time we get to the trail, Steve and Sarah had gotten the fuck out from the site, and we could hear a man chasing us several yards behind. We were able to find the cemetery rather easily, and I hopped over the fence first. When we all got over the fence, we noticed that Steve had not arrived yet, so we all hid in the cemetery. Luckily, to our advantage, it was pitch black by the time I turned my flashlight off, and we all hid there in complete silence. My heart sank when I heard the metallic shaking, as if someone was climbing over the fence. The guy had tracked us down, probably due to the fact that Steve had yelled out cemetery. We all stayed still, and we heard the ground crunch as the man took slow, deliberate steps. When in fight-or-flight moments, you're capable of a lot more than you would think, and your brain is put on some super high alert mode or some shit. As the man approached, I realized that I had my small Swiss Army pocket knife in my pocket. As the man's steps grew closer to me, when he was right about on top of me, I grabbed the knife, jumped out, and lodged it into the back of his knee. The man stumbled into the ground with a shriek of pain, and a metallic sound rang out as he dropped his weapon. Soon the pair of headlights came around the corner. Steve had finally made it. All four of us got up and ran towards the car. While I got up, the light gave me a glimpse of the guy. He was a tall, bulky man, and had a look of pure hatred in his eyes as he clutched the back of his knee. By his side was a huge machete that he had dropped. I was the last one to get into the car, and before I even fully closed the door, Steve floored it out of there. The girls were all bawling their eyes out. We drove until the first house, where we politely knocked and asked for directions to a motel. Thankfully, the people that answered were a very friendly and nice old couple. They told us there wasn't one around for miles, but they took us in and gave us warm food, and a place to rest for the remainder of the night. In the morning, the man brought his hunting rifle with us to retrieve our stuff from our campsite. When we finally got there, nothing was stolen, but all of our equipments and tents had been slashed up. The elderly woman called and made a report while we were gone. When we got back, the officers were at their home, and we each gave our statements. The officers said there wasn't enough evidence to find the guy, but they promised to try and do a thorough search. We headed home later that day. No one said a word the entire time. We were all trying to process what really happened. Unfortunately, the police never found the guy. Yeah, college split us up a bit, but we barely talk about it as a group, and it's been a whole year. My advice to all of you is to please find a populated place to camp. I don't care if it's some Yogi Bear camp, and be in reach of help and the police. And stay safe, guys, please. First off, let me apologize for grammatical errors, autocorrect, and the length. For a little bit of background about me, I never got along with my siblings much when we were younger. My parents spoiled me because I was the youngest, but a lot of the time they would believe my older brothers and sisters rather than me, simply because they were more mature. This whole ordeal started when I was 13 years old. We used to live in a rural area where acres and acres of woodland stood between houses. A lot of the time, my brothers and I would just mess around in the woods, boys being boys after all. We also had an old hound, Benji, that we would take out into the woods with us. The city is not too far away from us, and occasionally we would get a homeless person around, and tweakers deep in the woods, so on and so forth, but never too many issues. My brothers go back to college, and all that's left are my parents and my sister. I'd still go out to play in the woods, but it'd be all by myself or with Benji. Well, one afternoon, I went out with Benji when I noticed that he had started acting very weird. He was whimpering, tail between his legs and everything, just staring off into one direction. I started to get a bit freaked out, and was about to turn and head back, when something caught my eye. There was something lying on the ground. I thought it was an animal because it was furry, but then I noticed all of the blood. I got a little closer, and I could see that it was a dog. It had its stomach ripped open, and there was blood strewn everywhere. Its face was mangled and half ripped off, blood still dripping from its wounds. Benji started frantically pulling on the leash, barking and whimpering behind me, and that's when it hit me. The blood was still fresh. Whatever killed the dog was still around. I froze. I looked around and tried to see what Benji was barking at. I didn't know if it was a black bear or what, but there was something crouched behind a bush. All I could see was the fur. It was the afternoon now, and it had started to get darker. All of a sudden, the thing started barking. Not like an animal's barking, but like a crazy man trying to imitate a dog. He started out low and got louder and louder. I couldn't move. I started hyperventilating, and I got so scared I literally pissed my pants. Nothing was going on in my mind in that moment. I couldn't think. I was scared shitless. The man stood up and started slowly walking towards me. He was a bit hesitant because now Benji was barking and growling at him furiously in front of me. Suddenly he pulled out a giant knife, and all I could think of was to run. Run as fast as I could. I don't want to die, I kept saying to myself. So I started running. Luckily Benji ran with me, always circling around me and barking while I was in tears running for my life. I got back to my house, ran to my parents and told them what happened right away. Though they were a bit freaked out, they didn't really believe me and told me it was probably just a bear or something. They forbade me to go outside alone anymore. My sister kept telling me to stop crying out lies for attention. Of course, later that night I couldn't sleep at all. My sister and I shared a room, and Benji would always sleep in there with us. I got up and looked out the window every now and then, paranoid that I would see the man at the edge of the woods, or just something like that. After midnight, I had finally started to doze off when I heard Benji lonely growling again. I woke right up and saw that he was staring out the window. I slowly crept to the window and looked out to see the figure of the man right in the middle of the backyard, crouched down and staring straight through my window. Benji started growling louder and louder until it finally woke my sister up. She turned and asked me, "What the hell are you doing up?" But soon she saw there was something wrong with my expression. When she looked out the window, she screamed so loud it woke up both my parents. The man got spooked and ran off back into the woods before my dad got into the room, and my sister told them what she saw. Finally, they believed me, and they called the cops. When the cops got there, though, they said there wasn't much they could do. It was dark out, and they didn't have enough men to put a patrol car at the house. They said they'd come back in the morning to do a sweep of the woods around the area I found the dog. The next day, they did a search in the woods and found the carcass. A couple of hours later, they also found the creep close by. When they came back to update my parents on the situation, they told them that it was a guy on PCP covered in blood, wearing the skin of a dead animal. Apparently, he had killed a dog and ate it raw. Hey, so this event happened to me around last summer. It was probably the scariest story in my life, and I wanted to share it so that hopefully someone can learn from it. Something I've realized growing up, year by year, is that this world can be an amazing place, but it's also filled with some super sick people. And unfortunately, I've seen that side of our world firsthand. I'm a very social person, and I always love the opportunity to hang out with friends whenever possible. I'm also the type of person who's always looking for the next big thing. I guess I should tell you I was an 18-year-old male at the time of this story, and I have a decent-sized friend group of both boys and girls. And throughout high school, we had done a lot of crazy shit together. Being just out of high school, we wanted to do something insane together again before departing for college. And at that point, we all decided we'd like to go camping in the middle of nowhere for 3 days. Fun, right? And for some miracle, all of our parents thought it would be fine. So we had 6 people going. Me and my girlfriend Stephanie, my friend Brandon and his girlfriend Kaylee, and Steve and his girlfriend Sarah. We had decided to have 3 different tents for each couple, for reasons you can probably guess. Being a former Boy Scout, I was aware of everything we needed to survive for the 3 days: food, water, and other essential supplies. Being rebellious teenagers, we also stocked up on plenty of booze and weed for our fun getaway. So mid-July, we depart for our camping vacation. After hours of driving down back roads, we eventually find a place that looks secluded, but not sketchy like some horror stories. There were houses nearby, but not too close. Again, we weren't looking for some sketchy woods to camp out in. But unfortunately, this area had no cell phone service. It took us at least an hour to get everything set up. While the girls and Steve finished setting up the camp, Brandon and I took a look around while fetching firewood. Eventually, we came across a cool-looking trail. We weren't too concerned because there was a house within a mile radius. We assumed that those people must use this trail to hunt. It was pretty big in this area. Or maybe animals used it. If you're wondering about our car, we drove a Honda Pilot, which was Steve's, that had plenty of room for us and our supplies. We parked the car rather close to the site, so we had eyes on it at all times. The first night, nothing much happened. We rolled a blunt, drank a bit, and called it a night. The next day, we decided to explore the woods a bit. Brandon and Kaylee stayed behind to watch the site and spend some quality time together. The rest of us decided to go down the path we had found earlier. Around 20 minutes down the path, Steve spotted a metal fence. We approached it to find a cemetery. The cemetery looked very old, but there were signs of activity there. Not some voodoo or occult-like stuff. Some flowers and notes left at the graves. Beyond the cemetery, we saw a bigger trail that had tire tracks and a half-assed parking lot for the area. We ventured down the path a bit more to spot some deer, then headed back because it was started to get late. That night we partied really hard because we had to leave the next day and didn't want to return with extra beer or weed. This night was the polar opposite of the other night. The other night was peaceful, and we had assumed this night would be the same as we all began to turn in. But boy were we fucking wrong. You would assume there would have been warning signs early in our trip, like a rusty knife on the path, or foot tracks around our site. But it wasn't like that at all. All of a sudden, we woke up to a blood-curdling scream coming from Steve and Sarah's tent, as we heard the fabric being ripped by what we assumed was something sharp. I guess Steve hit the man really hard with his flashlight and was able to get both himself and Sarah to his car. Here's the issue. Steve's tent is closest to the car, while the other 2 tents were closer to the trail. To get to Steve's car, we had to get past whatever had attacked Steve and Sarah. Luckily, all our drunken selves were gone, because before getting into his car, he yelled cemetery, and it clicked in my head. The trail on the other side of the cemetery. I quickly grabbed Brendan, Kaylee, and Stephanie and started running towards that trail. I used my phone flashlight to help us see. You might think, why would you turn your flashlight on? Well, the last thing I wanted was to completely miss the cemetery and be lost in the woods with whatever attacked Steve. By the time we get to the trail, Steve and Sarah had gotten the fuck out from the site, and we could hear a man chasing us several yards behind. We were able to find the cemetery rather easily, and I hopped over the fence first. When we all got over the fence, we noticed that Steve had not arrived yet, so we all hid in the cemetery. Luckily, to our advantage, it was pitch black by the time I turned my flashlight off, and we all hid there in complete silence. My heart sank when I heard the metallic shaking, as if someone was climbing over the fence. The guy had tracked us down, probably due to the fact that Steve had yelled out cemetery. We all stayed still, and we heard the ground crunch as the man took slow, deliberate steps. When in fight-or-flight moments, you're capable of a lot more than you would think, and your brain is put on some super high alert mode or some shit. As the man approached, I realized that I had my small Swiss Army pocket knife in my pocket. As the man's steps grew closer to me, when he was right about on top of me, I grabbed the knife, jumped out, and lodged it into the back of his knee. The man stumbled into the ground with a shriek of pain, and a metallic sound rang out as he dropped his weapon. Soon the pair of headlights came around the corner. Steve had finally made it. All four of us got up and ran towards the car. While I got up, the light gave me a glimpse of the guy. He was a tall, bulky man, and had a look of pure hatred in his eyes as he clutched the back of his knee. By his side was a huge machete that he had dropped. I was the last one to get into the car, and before I even fully closed the door, Steve floored it out of there. The girls were all bawling their eyes out. We drove until the first house, where we politely knocked and asked for directions to a motel. Thankfully, the people that answered were a very friendly and nice old couple. They told us there wasn't one around for miles, but they took us in and gave us warm food and a place to rest for the remainder of the night. In the morning, the man brought his hunting rifle with us to retrieve our stuff from our campsite. When we finally got there, nothing was stolen, but all of our equipment and tents had been slashed up. The elderly woman called and made a report while we were gone. When we got back, the officers were at their home, and we each gave our statements. The officers said there wasn't enough evidence to find the guy, but they promised to try and do a thorough search. We headed home later that day. No one said a word the entire time. We were all trying to process what really happened. Unfortunately, the police never found the guy. Yeah, college split us up a bit, but we barely talk about it as a group, and it's been a whole year. My advice to all of you is to please find a populated place to camp. I don't care if it's some Yogi Bear camp, and be in reach of help and the police. And stay safe, guys, please. This happened about 2 years ago, and still scares me whenever I think about it. First, though, a little background. My name's Jesse, and I live in the UK. I'm from a smallish area, nothing fancy. I'm 18 now, and at the time I was 16, and working at a family friend's pub collecting glasses. I'd work from 7 to 11 every night, and I lived about half an hour to 45 minutes away. And to get home, I had to walk through a park. Now this park has 3 entrances, and 2 at the top and 1 at the bottom, which led into the town center and main shopping area. The top 2 led off into 2 different areas. One was a skate park, and the other is literally right next to a comprehensive school and a big field. This park has a lot of bushes and trees in it, and only has a few lights. These lights all shut off at around 10:30. The only lights on are the lampposts outside each entrance to the park, which are very dim. Each entrance was a very big gate, and they were always open. And this is important for later. I had to walk the path that led towards the school, since it was the fastest way for me to get home. Now onto the story. I worked at the pub for about a year, and had stuck to the same routine going home. I'd leave at around 11, sometimes a few minutes before, sometimes a few minutes after. It took about 10 minutes to get to the park, so I'd be walking through the park at around 11:30 sometimes, or just about 15 minutes past. Now the one entrance I had to use to get into the park was the one at the bottom, the one that leads to the shopping area. It had 1 lamppost outside the gate, and that was it. It was the only light, so I could see only about 10 feet into the park. There were a few benches. No one was ever in the park when I walked through it from work. During the autumn and winter weeks, it was always empty. Even the streets were, so you could imagine my shock when one night I saw a man sitting on the bench as I walked through the park gates. This was so strange to me. It was about 45 minutes past 11, almost midnight. It was pitch black and freezing, and this man was just casually sitting on the bench. I couldn't see him too well at first, but as I got closer I got a good look at him. He was young, about 20 to 25 I'd guess. Long hair and a ponytail, but not a scruffy one, tight and neat. He had a hoop earring and his nose was pierced. I can't remember his eye color. He was so pale, and his hair was jet black with red tips which went past his shoulders. He wore all black. To be honest, he dressed kind of like an emo. Looking back now, he kind of reminds me and looks like Dracula from a movie, Van Helsing. He was on his phone. He looked up at me as I walked towards him, and he stared at me the whole time I walked past. I gave him a slight nod and smile, and kept walking. He just looked me up and down, smirking, which freaked me out a bit. He didn't say anything, and I managed to get home. I didn't think much of him and completely forgot about the encounter. The next night, though, I went to work, finished my shift, and walked through the park. Again, he was there, on his phone, wearing all black. He looked up, saw me, and smiled. I smiled back, but walked a bit faster past him. Again, he said nothing. This happened on the next night as well, but on the fourth night he wasn't there. I walked through the park as usual, but I felt so uneasy. It was pitch black, no light except for the moon. And what do I hear? Footsteps. Quick footsteps right behind me. So I turn around and absolutely nothing. I wasn't taking any chances, so I ran through the park. I swear over the sound of my heart beating fast and my own footsteps, I heard twigs snapping and leaves crunching. After that, I started getting a lift home for about 2 weeks from a friend. Soon, though, that friend went on holiday, so I had to start walking home through the park again. On the first night, which was Monday night, the man wasn't there, but I still felt very uneasy. I could feel I was being watched. The second night he was there, sitting on the bench, smiling, looking at me, but this time he spoke. In a very deep voice he said, "Hey baby, love the tights and skirt. Damn." I was wearing a black skirt and sheer tights with thick black thigh-high socks, Doc Martens with a black biker jacket and a thick scarf. I had to wear all black for work. I looked at him awkwardly, smiled, and hurried away. The next few weeks he'd be in the park and make sexual comments, but he always just sat on the bench. I'd try and get lifts home when I could, but I'd still have to walk through the park most of the time. Lord, I hated that walk. One night, though, things escalated. I walked through the park as usual. Again, he was there sitting and smiling at me. I did my best to ignore him as he made comments about my body and all the things he wanted to do to me. As I was walking away, I was out of the light and could only see 2 or 3 feet in front of me. I must have been about 20 feet away when I heard running from behind me. I turned around and, bam! Somebody runs into me full speed and knocks me right to the floor. I felt a heavy weight on me, and instantly I felt hair on my face and a hand covering my mouth. That familiar deep voice tells me not to fight, that it'll be over quicker if I don't. It's him. He's on top of me and his hands start to wander down my stomach. He starts to lift my skirt up. I hear a zipper, and he's rambling about how he knows I want this, and how he's been waiting to do this for so long. He took his hand off my mouth, and that's when I took the chance. I bit him, hard, really fucking hard, and he screamed. He sat up off of me. I could barely see, but he was holding his hand and cursing at me. I took the opportunity and shoved him. I got up and started to run. I could hear him running after me. I ran towards the first gate, the one I usually use to leave. I was shocked and mortified to see it was locked somehow. I could see it had a lock on it, because the lamppost on the other side shone onto the gate. I was confused, but I could hear him shouting. I started to run again, and I ran towards the other gate. It was closed, but not all the way. There was a small enough gap that I could squeeze through. I just managed to squeeze past as he tried to grab me. I turned and looked at him for a few seconds, catching my breath. He stared at me, and then he tried to fit through the gate, so I booked it as fast as I could. And I ran towards the skate park path. The path was full of bushes. On one side of the path I ran through it. It also has a long dark patch with after about a 20-minute walk down it leads to a main road. It's usually completely dead though. I ran through the skate park and hid in the bushes waiting for him to come. If I had ran onto the long path, I'd be completely visible and he'd be able to see and chase me since no one was around. I'd stand no chance. The path that led to the roads had very few lights, but still had enough that he'd be able to see me from long away. I sat in the bushes hiding with my hand over my mouth. I sat for a minute when I saw him running through the skate park looking for me. He slowed down near the exit path, and he literally stood there for a minute sniffing the air. No joke. His hair wasn't in a ponytail anymore. It was all over. He wasn't wearing a coat. He wore a long-sleeved shirt, all black. It was winter, which confused me, since it was so damn cold. He looked around, and I felt his eyes scan over me. Then he kept looking and started walking down the long path. After about 10 minutes, I felt it was safe enough, and ran back towards the park. I ran into the park and ran to the gate I usually go through to get home. It was still locked, so I hopped it. I walked towards the school, following the path I always used. I had a strange urge to look back, and there at the gate the man was standing, watching me walk away. He laughed and shouted out to me, "I'll catch you one day, baby girl. Mark my words." He blew me a kiss and walked away into the darkness. I'd never been so scared in all my life. I booked it home and told my mom what happened. She called the police and council and asked why the fence was locked. The council was just as confused, as it had been their policy to never lock the gate, ever. The police couldn't do much. They put a warning out and that was about it. The creepy thing was, he had to have learned my pattern. He knew I used that park every night to get home. It creeps me out to this day, knowing I was being watched and could have been assaulted or worse. I still have nightmares from time to time about him, and wonder what would have happened to me had I not gotten away, or had he seen me in the bushes. I quit working at that pub, and haven't used the park since. I was around 16 at the time of this happening. Firstly, I'd like to explain what type of person I am, so my actions make a bit of sense. I'm an average-looking girl, a bit overweight, which for my country makes me really undesirable. For this reason, I'm not used to men hitting on me, or even considered it a possible occurrence back then. You can say that I'm usually the man in our group. You know, the girl who looks after every other friend when they're drinking, and if a guy is being rude or harassing someone, I'm the one to shut him down. I don't know why I took on this role. Probably just because my friends are way too naive and nice. Well, I'm like that to strangers when I'm alone. I always try to be helpful to people if they look confused or ask me for directions or anything else. On this particular night, I was going home from school. My high school is in the city center, and I take the bus home. Since the buses get overcrowded during peak hours, and I really hate being between crowds of people, I usually wait around 30 minutes to an hour to catch the bus. This night I had walked to another bus stop, about 5 stops before the one to my school, so I could kill the time and take an emptier bus. It was dark, and I was the only one on that stop. I usually don't have a problem with going out alone late at night. I don't have that whole men bat assault mentality drilled into me. So I'm just sitting there minding my own business, when this 45 to 50-year-old man comes right up to me. He had a very friendly face and smile, so I didn't think anything was particularly off. He asks me something, and then I realize he's Turkish. I tell him I don't understand what he's saying, so he uses basic Bulgarian words he knows, and I somehow understand that he's trying to ask for directions. Of course, I tried my best to explain, and after I feel like he understood, I expected him to just stop talking to me. Nope. He sat disturbingly close to me, and started talking to me again in Turkish. I try to be polite and politely ignore him as best as I can, while I'm nodding my head with a smile looking at the timetable. For some reason, this man started asking me for my phone number. At this moment, I realize that this is definitely not only a lost foreigner. I try to shut him down by saying I don't have a phone. Don't ask why I thought that was going to work. I finally give in and decide to tell him a random number. He says something else to me that I don't understand, and then the worst thing happens. All this time I'm looking at the 1 minute the bus will be coming in. I'm praying for him to please not try to call the number. Well, he does right away, and he shows me and asks why my phone isn't ringing. My stomach just flipped. I tried to think of something fast. Then I remembered that I had my old Motorola in my bag. I usually brought it to school to give to the teachers who collected phones during class. I also liked playing games on it in 2014. Fortunately, the battery was dead, so I pretended that this was the reason the call hadn't gone through. I could see the guy starting to try to argue, but at this moment the bus came and I got on right away. I sat on the seat behind the driver as always. After 10 minutes, I started to get a weird feeling. I don't know what it was, but I felt like I was being watched. So I start to look around, but since I'm in the front seat, I can't exactly see everything. Luckily, our buses have this gigantic mirror on the inside that shows the whole bus. I look into the mirror, and I can clearly see him. He's sitting in the last seat, his legs clearly visible. I started to panic. Of course, I wasn't sure he was following me, but I'm also a very cautious person, so I couldn't just ignore it. I started checking for him at every stop, and he was always still there. I got paranoid and decided to say fuck it and get off the bus early. The stop was at our local mall, and luckily it was open until 10 p.m. I decided that I'd go in, and if he followed, then I'd know he was following me. He followed, all right. You have to understand that in my town, almost nobody goes out after 9 p.m., so the mall was very close to empty. I looked around thinking of ways to disappear on him, but there was just no way. The mall is a wide open space and there are 3 floors, almost empty. It'd be easy to spot me anywhere. Now you'll probably think at this point, you should have asked the security for help. No. In Bulgaria, we don't really do that. That literally never even went through my mind. And besides, the security there is just some old grandpa that walks around all day. He doesn't even actually do work or anything. If it were today, I might not be as stupid, but back then this wasn't even an option that I considered. Besides, the security wasn't even around. So I do the most logical thing I can do. I decided to use the knowledge I had acquired the previous week. You see, the mall had a cool corridor system behind the stores. It was completely unmarked by any signs, and if you didn't know where you were going, you'd probably get lost, because it's just endless white corridors that lead to empty rooms for storage or other things. Well, me, being an avid anime fan, loved going around these corridors and pretending to be a ninja. 16-year-olds, am I right? So I can proudly say that I learned the right path to the back stairway of the mall. Because I was smart and obsessed with the idea of being a spy, I decided to lure the creepy man into the corridors and then go out from the back end of the mall. I first encountered him and pretended to look around, just to see if he was really stalking me. He didn't even try to hide it. He just stood right outside the store staring right at me. I got scared for a second, but then I remembered that I was the best 007 agent out there, so I continued walking around the mall. I finally entered the back corridors, and at this point I booked it to the staircase. I ran right out, and didn't stop running for about 2 bus stops. I looked back, but there was no one there, so I proudly decided that I was a hero and went home. Today, being a 21-year-old grown-up, I think about how stupid that all was, and how I'd probably be 10 times as scared today than I was back then. But I hope it never comes to that. I have a lot of other creepy things that have happened to me, so one day I might get around to writing the rest. This happened quite a few years ago. I was a 21-year-old female college student, studying abroad at a university in the Kansai region of Japan. I had lived a fairly sheltered suburb life until that point, so this experience really stood out to me at the time. I also grew up in a fairly religious household, although my parents were never strict about it, and are what I would usually call socially liberal Catholics. I had friends who had gone to the university previously, and they had introduced me to a nice Japanese woman aged around 45 to 50. I'll call her Kotoko, not her real name. It turned out that every year, Kotoko hired an American student from my program to help her learn English. Her husband worked, but she didn't, and they never had any kids, so she spent all her time studying, cooking, and reading. With my friend's introduction, she had a friend who had worked for her the previous year. I agreed to become her next tutor. Kotoko and her husband were really great. I'd go to their house every Wednesday afternoon, and we'd spend about 2 hours on English, and at the end, 30 to 60 minutes on Japanese. She knew I was slated to take the Japanese fluency test at the end of my time in Japan, and insisted on helping me, even though she was paying me around $50 a week to help her. We grew close during this time, and I went to a wine tasting with her and her husband. When my mom visited, Kotoko hosted a dinner for us. For around 7 months or so, we both had a great relationship. It bears noting that she never mentioned religion at all during this time. One week, we decided we would do a Saturday morning session, and then go get lunch together. Friday night, I received an email from Kotoko. Although she had my email from the beginning, we had only ever texted, and very rarely, so it was strange to get one out of nowhere. Also, the email came in at around 3:30 in the morning, so I didn't see it until Saturday, about 2 hours before I was scheduled to arrive at her apartment. The email said, paraphrasing as it's been over a decade, "Are we still on for today, or are you still mad at me?" Absolutely confused, I responded, "Of course we are, and I'm not mad. I'll be there in about 2 hours." We had never had a fight or any harsh words at all. Less than an hour later, I got another email from Kotoko. The email described how she and I had had a huge fight the night before, and that she would forgive me and was relieved I wasn't angry. Since we hadn't spoken in almost a week, I was pretty thrown, but I knew Kotoko and I figured I would just speak to her about it when I got there. I got to the apartment and her husband was there. He was never there on Wednesdays. I found this comforting because I knew him well, so if she kept acting strange, I'm sure he would notice and explain about the situation. I sat down with her to begin our lesson. Kotoko's English was pretty good, but this day she had a really hard time pronouncing things. From the beginning, I could see her frustration trying to speak, as if she couldn't pour her passion into the words properly. She quickly switched over to Japanese and started a fast, anxious conversation about our fight. No matter what I said, I couldn't convince her that we'd never fought. In fact, denying it made her even more anxious, and she began telling me that I just didn't remember the fight because I wasn't enlightened, and others were convincing me I didn't remember. The lesson never happened. Kotoko got more and more agitated. She told me my friends, a few of whom she had met, so she named them by name, were evil and bad, and dragging me down to hell. She told me I was sinning for drinking and clubbing with my friends each week. She was so intense and certain, I began to develop a real fear. Of what I didn't know. I kept throwing glances to the study where I had seen her husband, assuming he would hear her ranting and come out to calm her down. But he never did. Finally, since we weren't studying, I suggested that we just go get lunch. I wanted to be in a public space. Outside her apartment building, Kotoko grabbed my arm so hard, I thought it would bruise. She was a tiny person, so it was shocking. She looked directly into my eyes and said, "Your friend is going straight to hell, but I can save her." Lunch was awful. By this point I had been listening to her for 2 hours, and the constant ranting was getting to me. She told me how my parents and best friend were already lost, but she could save me. When I just stared at her in horror, she revised it so that she could save me and one other, and pressed me to pick the person I loved the most, my mom, dad, brother, or best friend, so she could save us all from hell or the darkness. She went to the bathroom, and I started frantically texting my friend Kevin to come to the local station, because I was terrified. When she got out of the bathroom, she looked directly at me and said, "I know you're texting Kevin. He can't save you. Only I can." She couldn't have possibly seen my phone from where she was standing. Finally, unable to take it anymore, I blurted out that I couldn't choose someone to save, so I didn't deserve to be saved either, and ran as fast as I could out of the restaurant. At this point, she had convinced me that my parents and best friend had died or were somehow in danger, and I ran to the station, where I called my parents long distance. When my mom answered, at 3 a.m. her time, I burst into tears. I was so relieved that she was all right. When Kevin arrived, it took him around 2 hours to calm me down and make me realize I hadn't met a disturbing prophet, but that she was likely just mentally ill. I had never met someone who was in the middle of experiencing a mental break, and her conviction had pulled me right in, until I truly couldn't figure out if she knew something about existence and the afterlife that I didn't. The fact that her husband acted perfectly normally and never indicated anything was going to go wrong is to this day one of the strangest things about the soul to me. A few days after this incident, Kotoko emailed me to confirm our Wednesday session. I was petrified and only responded that I didn't think it would be good to continue, but I wished her well. She sent me many more emails and letters, and even sent a few letters to my parents' house in the U.S. None of the letters mentioned religion or that day. I never responded again. I think this experience is one of the reasons I later became an atheist. I just couldn't ever look at the ideas of heaven and hell the same way again, and they were always tinged with a real fear for me. I sincerely hope she got the help she needed, and is doing better now, but I really don't want to meet again. Cross-posting from when I typed it out ages ago. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I was visiting my friend in Budapest, who was working in a hostel. We ended up going out and drinking pretty heavily, and meeting these two girls. We hung out with them through the night, and offered to walk them back to their place. When we got there, my friend, who had a girl on lock, was like, "I'll come back with you tomorrow, Andrew." I just said, "Dude, you've got a girl that wants you to come up to her place. It's a short walk from here to get home. Just stay." He kept saying no, and I jokingly said, "Well, you can't leave with me if you can't find me." And I started running away. I was a pretty stupid drunk, but it was funny at the time. Anyways, I ran for a few minutes and quickly lost my bearings. I had an empty wallet and no phone. I just thought I'd wander, spot a landmark, and find my way home from there. Hell, if I had to, I'd sleep on the street. I was walking for about 30 minutes at this point, really extremely drunk. A car pulled up and a guy yelled at me in Hungarian. I just replied, "Sorry man, English only," and laughed a little. He was parked and I was chilling, so we talked for a few minutes. He seemed alright and said that he could take me back to the hostel. I said yes and went to hop in the back, and there were two guys back there that I couldn't see through the tinted windows. These guys were both super tatted up and very thug-looking. I was too drunk to run if they were gonna rob me, so I just put on a brave face and got in. I was starting to sober up really fast. They started driving, and I immediately realized something is going on. Basically, Budapest was two separate cities on either side of a river, Buda and Pest. We were on the pest side with most of the clubs and such, and we almost immediately crossed over. I knew I didn't live on that side. I decided to speak up. Hey man, my hostel is in pest. Why are we going over there? They all just laughed and went quiet again. Finally, the driver pipes up and says, "Man, no one knows where you went tonight. What would you do if we tried to beat you up?" They're all laughing. I checked my door handle and it was child-locked. I started to feign being sick and rolled down my window, slightly leaning out. The whole time they were talking, saying they could kill me and no one would even know, that I didn't even know where I was now. I just remember looking at my feet and saying, "If you guys try anything tonight, I know you'll hurt me or maybe kill me, but I promise I'll kill one of you with me." And they would just laugh. We kept getting further away from the city, almost to the point there were no buildings at all. We kept going back and forth with the threats when we hit a red light. Everyone at the car was kind of at ease, since they thought I was too drunk to try anything. I leaned out the window, grabbed the handle from the outside, and popped the door open. I fell backwards onto the pavement and rolled, and just started running as fast as I could. The car stopped for a moment, but I was shouting, so they just peeled away. It was around 4 or 5 a.m. I found some guys playing Pokemon Go. This was when it was at peak time, so there were a lot of people out, thank God. Of course, they looked terrified that this bleeding drunk man was approaching. I explained my situation, and they were super sympathetic. They called me a cab. I took the cab back to the hostel. All I had was 20 Canadian in my wallet, and I begged the driver to take it. He did. I got to my room as the sun started to rise, when my friend asked me what happened. Apparently all I said was, "I got kidnapped. I'm sleeping now, I'll tell you tomorrow," and passed out right away on my bed. Just recently, about 5 months ago, my family moved into the house we're in right now, after doing renovations on it for about 2 to 3 years straight. The house is in a low middle-class neighborhood and needed a lot of work. After finally finishing it, we moved in ASAP and got all settled. It was very cozy, and the neighbors are all super nice. However, after about a week or two of being in the house, at about 5 in the morning I woke up and decided to go get a glass of water before getting ready for school. To my surprise, I looked out of the window into the front yard and saw a man walking back and forth under the streetlight. Creepy as hell, yeah, but after about only a few seconds of watching him, he looked up and continued on down the road. I didn't think much of this at this point. It may have been someone walking home or to another location, so I just dropped it and didn't tell my parents or friends or anything. Fast forward to the end of June. I woke up at about 3 in the morning to my dogs going absolutely ballistic. I scrambled to get them to calm down, since I didn't want my mom or dad waking up and getting mad about it. However, I looked out the window and noticed the same man standing there under the streetlight, staring at or into our house. This unnerved me greatly, and I turned the lights on. Almost immediately, the man started to walk away. My dogs finally calmed down, and I woke my dad up and told him about it. My dad didn't really seem to worry too much of it, and told me to tell him if I saw him again. I agreed to this and went right back to bed. About a week ago, I was unloading a storage unit pod in our backyard. I was home alone and it was getting rather late. I wanted to retrieve my guitar case before I lent my guitar to my friend. My dogs started barking like crazy, and I immediately went to check what they were barking at. Lo and behold, there was that man again, in the same spot staring at our house. I had 3 choices. Call the cops, call my dad, or be a tough guy. My dumbass chose option C. I grabbed a baseball bat from my room and walked outside. The moment I opened the door, he began to immediately walk away. I screamed at him, "Hey, get back here!" In response, he started to run. Once my folks got home, I got a major earful, and rightfully so. My dad and mom called the cops, and they did the best they could with what little we had. They simply told us to call again if anything else happened, and went right on their way. Now, last night, I was getting home with my dad, mom, and sister after a night out with some family friends. As we pulled up into our driveway, there he was, but this time he was in our yard. The moment the headlights shined on him, he ran down the road. My dad cursed, parked the car, and got out with his gun. He stared at the man as he ran away. My sister, mom, and I went inside immediately to call the cops. We didn't know what happened after we went inside, but according to my dad, the man turned around and stared back at him for a while before running off again. I don't know if this guy will be back, or how long he's been doing this. I hope nothing spirals out of control, but we're installing cameras. My neighbor claims to have spotted him staring again. My dad has had enough and bought some off Amazon. Hope this stops soon.
I was a pretty and relatively smart 15-year-old girl, a good kid who did well in school despite a tough childhood. I was working at an amusement park full-time during the summer. The area I lived in could be a bit sketchy at times, but having grown up with little to no adult supervision, I was used to trying to look out for myself. My father was out of town. Mother was long out of the picture. My sister, 3 years older, and myself were staying at our home alone. I finished work at 11 p.m. when the park closed that day, and walked myself home as I usually did. It wasn't very far at all, perhaps just a 10-minute walk. I arrived to an empty home, my sister still out somewhere, and I got ready for bed, putting my pajamas on and crawling down into it. I was just starting to fall asleep when I heard a small noise. I didn't know what it was, but it didn't seem like just a usual house noise. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor with stairs leading up to it. I didn't hear anything after that noise though, so I didn't investigate and chalked it up to nothing. I started to fall back asleep, when just as I was about to, I heard what sounded like hesitant footsteps on the stairs. I was instantly bolted awake, but in my mind it must have been my sister coming home, climbing the stairs to where her bedroom was. Still laying in bed, I called out, "Wendy? Wendy, is that you?" I heard nothing back and yelled again. Nothing, but more footsteps. I was petrified, but as I tell the story to this day, I don't understand some of my reactions that night, so I really can't explain them well. I got out of bed, opened the ajar bedroom door fully, and went out to the stairs, where I stood at the top. Below me, about halfway up the stairs, was a man I had never seen before. He looked to be early 20s, just a bit taller than my 5'7". Not a huge guy, but he had a solid build with blonde curly hair. I asked the man what the hell he was doing. His reply was a garbled mess of something along the lines of, "Where's Wendy? My mother told me not to get mixed up with women. Where's Wendy?" From his manner and wild-eyed look, it seemed like he may have been doing some drugs. He had followed me home from the park and was asking where's Wendy in response to my calling out for her. For some reason, at this exact moment, I got very angry. Not just scared, but angry. I started screaming at him to get out, to get the hell out of my house, that I was going to call my father and Wendy. To my surprise, he did just that. He turned around and ran back down the stairs like a bat out of hell, and I didn't see where he went after that. It turns out he must have just left. I have no idea how he even got in the first place. but he was definitely there for me. That's why he'd followed me home. Not burglary or anything else. He was looking to rape and who knows what else. I think the only reason he actually left was because he had no idea where my sister Wendy was and thought she was in the house with me. It was an added complication to possibly getting him caught. I was so shaken I stayed up the rest of the night. I didn't call the cops, didn't call a friend. The only person I told was my sister the next day. I don't know why I did that. I just sat in a rocking chair clutching my cat, rocking and crying, staying awake till the next morning. My sister never did come home that night, stayed at a friend's and came home the next day. This all happened 35 years ago, but I've still never told anyone until now. This actually happened a few hours ago, and I'm still unsettled about the whole encounter. I decided to drop it over here and get some of it out of my system. I've had creeps tailgate me or try to grab my attention on the road. Usually I just ignore them, which has always worked. But this guy takes the golden medal. My shift starts at the afternoon. I had been feeling off for almost the entire day. A beautiful sunny day as well, mind you. You know, it's just one of those days where you drag yourself out of bed because you have to do the adulting. I decided to lift my mood up, so I wore something new that I had. A beautiful creamy white faux fur vest. I hit the road. Look like $1 million bucks? Feel like $1 million bucks, right? Well, maybe not. I played some piano tracks and hoped that I'd just get out of this funk. I really needed something to comfort me though, and those two things just weren't cutting it. While I was driving to work, I decided to grab a drink. An iced, crisp green tea would definitely lift my spirit. There were 2 branches of a famous coffee shop. You know who, grinning mermaid who's playing Twister, ring the bell? I could have gone to the first one with the drive-thru, but they use a pretty crappy tea brand, as they'd run out of the good stuff. So I had to go to the one that was inside a mall. Anything to feel better, right? I parked my car and saw a private fleet of black SUVs making it quite difficult to view the entrance. This will be important later. I grabbed a cold bottle of water and headed over to the counter. I paid for my drink and got a cherry lollipop as well because why not? I waited to receive everything, and once I'd gotten it all, I started walking out. I had to pass by a fountain in the courtyard before I could reach the exit. I slowed my pace as I noticed I was walking a bit too fast. I felt a bit off now, but I brushed it off. As I passed between the SUVs, a bus shot through quickly. I stopped in shock as I'd almost just walked into its path. This didn't make me realize what was happening though. I'd gotten distracted and wasn't immediately aware of my surroundings. As I walked even further, I had to pass by an area where there wasn't anyone present. It was quite shaded, but still outdoors. It was almost like a under-the-bridge style building, if that makes sense. This was the only way to my car. I still wasn't very aware of my surroundings, until suddenly I heard footsteps over to my right. I turned and saw a man in my peripheral vision, walking and exactly matching my speed. At first, I thought he was in a uniform, so I assumed he was a part of the cleaning staff in the mall perhaps. Something told me that probably wasn't right, but I told myself I was being paranoid and overthinking things. I noticed as well that next to my car on the left side was a woman with a child getting into their own car. I was sandwiched between my car and hers. I was getting my keys out of my fur vest. I had to turn around in order to open my driver's door, as I was a bit ahead of it. Once I turned though, I fully saw that man standing there. He looked about his late 30s, skinny, average height. He had a dark blue baseball cap with sunglasses, a gray shirt with some random print on it, and black sweatpants. Croc shoes with socks too. He was so close to me that it took me by surprise a little bit, and I was startled. Being nice and polite is in my blood though, so I tried to not immediately assume the worst. The first thing he said though when he noticed I'd seen him was, "Why are you afraid?" I told him that I wasn't and asked him what he wanted. "Is your car for sale?" he said while grinning. I said no. Then he started to ask about how my day was going, stuff along those lines. What the fuck, man? I don't know you. Alarm bells were ringing in my head now. I smiled as to not escalate the situation. I knew I had to do something though. He was blocking my way to the mall entrance. I decided to go the other way, which was a pretty large shaded parking lot with a few people here and there. It was nice to meet you, but I gotta leave, I said while smiling. Give me your phone number, he said bluntly. I just repeated the same phrase and took a step closer to my door, as I didn't want to show him that I was afraid. I was pooping bricks at that moment. He then said something that made me want to crawl out of my skin. Give me your phone number so I don't have to chase you around in my car. At this moment, I knew I had to move fast, so I opened my door and ignored him. He kept talking. I wasn't sure what he was saying, as it all felt muffled. My anxiety was higher than the tip of Mount Everest now. I was hit with the realization that even in a public space in broad daylight with people around, you can lose your sense of safety in a split second. I closed the door and quickly locked it. My fingers felt weak, but I managed to still turn on the car. He kept knocking at my window the entire time. He was so insistent. I put my car into reverse mode, but I still couldn't back out because the woman was halfway getting out of her parking spot, and thus forcing me to wait. He kept knocking pretty hard, saying all kinds of weird stuff. At that moment, I honestly chose to ignore him. All I wanted was to nope out of there. I was so afraid and just baffled. I had to look at the window to see when the road would be clear, so I could back out while he was standing in front of the window rapidly knocking on it. I avoided making eye contact with him. Once the coast was clear, I slammed the gas pedal and sped off. I drove to random places while my eyes were fixed on my rearview mirror, making sure he wasn't following me. It was so hard to breathe, as my chest felt heavy and my heart was beating out of my chest. I'm glad he wasn't there, though. This creep had followed me around the mall and waited for the right moment when I was alone, and threatened me to give him my phone number, totally unaware of just how much of a creep he was being. My therapist will definitely have to hear about this. I worked in a residential healthcare facility, and for a number of years I worked with a woman named Kajiri. She was generally okay to work with, but she could be all kinds of intense. That sort of joking flirtation that often finds its way into high-pressure environments was quite common throughout the entire team, but when she directed it at me, it didn't seem quite so jokey. It took me forever to realize that, because I usually don't notice someone flirting with me until someone else points it out 6 months later. But eventually, when she started trying to give me jewelry and chocolate bouquets, I finally caught a clue. In between things being normal and actually maybe not really so normal, there was a long escalation of text messages, comments that made me uncomfortable, personal space violations, dropping by my house uninvited, hanging around on my shift hours long after hers had finished, unwanted touching, etc. Once I realized all this was happening, I put as much distance between us as possible. I stopped answering the calls and texts, locked down social media, spoke to other colleagues and had them running interference as well. Quite a lot of interference, actually. At the time, it just became sort of a running joke, but looking back on it, it was all kinds of fucked up. She even parked outside my house sometimes. I'd sit in the back room with the lights off, so she'd think I wasn't home. Honestly, 2018 me is looking back at 2016 me throwing popcorn and screaming, "Do something, you stupid cow!" But hey, 2016 me was alarmingly chill. After a couple of months of my disappearing woman act, though, she seemed to get the hint and backed right off. I was very pleased, and we all got on with our lives and lived happily ever after, right? No. A few months after it had died down, I heard through the grapevine that Kajiri seemed to have focused her attentions on a new coworker, Linda. Linda and I did have a close mutual friend, but we didn't really know each other that well. I didn't think too much of it beyond, "Good luck, you poor fucker." A few months later again, though, I get a call out of the blue from the mutual friend Linda and I share. Without preamble, he asked, "Were you dating Kajiri?" No. I was shocked. He had been privy to all the awkward details of my experience with Kajiri, and had helped to run interference even. He explained that he'd been talking to Linda, and she'd asked about my relationship. The story that followed still sounds too fantastical to actually have happened in an actual sensible grown-up workplace. Apparently, Kajiri had been catfishing her own best friend Amanda posing as Linda. In a string of emails, Linda and Amanda had discussed Kajiri's drug problem, her abusive and dangerous ex, none other than yours truly, Linda coming out to her family after her brother caught her in bed with Kajiri, and even more. The jig was up when Linda got a second job, coincidentally with Amanda's husband, who mentioned how great it was to finally meet Kajiri's girlfriend. That puzzled poor straight single Linda. This woman had been living out an entire soap opera, using her coworkers and friends as set pieces. Linda and I reported her to management, and she was immediately suspended pending investigation. She quit a short 2 days later. Unfortunately, HR decided they needed to continue their investigation of the allegation that I had an orgy at work, because that's a totally plausible thing to just happen with nobody noticing and not at all made up by a crazy woman. I left that job just a month later myself, and when I interviewed for my current job, she had interviewed just a half an hour before me, and they were looking to hire 2 people. Thankfully, she didn't get the job, but there have been other openings since then, and she's applied for all of them. I'm terrified of meeting her again. It turned out she has a history of inpatient psych treatment for delusional behavior, and was known to be obsessive about people she took a liking to. In fact, according to Facey, her current girlfriend, real, not real, B, who knows, has a similar first name as me, and shares more than a few physical similarities as well. She also still knows where I live. So a long time ago, I had a falling out with a friend who liked to cyber harass people she didn't like. Because I already knew this, I took precautions on all my social media, and even added 2-step verification where it would send codes to your cell phone if someone tried to log in or change your password. Seemed like a pretty safe step, right? I never even thought about it any further until just a few days ago. I got sent an SMS text from a random number that addressed me by my full first name. This freaked me out a little, of course, because the spelling of my first name is pretty uncommon where I'm from. No big deal, maybe it's an old friend who changed phones or something. I gave the classic, "Who dis?" back at them, to which I received an even stranger text back. "Oh my goodness, it's you! Are you 18? I have something I want to cash app you." Well, that's weird, I thought. Probably just some scam to hack my Cash App or something. I said again, "Who the fuck is this?" Never received a text back from that number. No less than 5 minutes later, though, I get 3 calls and 2 spam voicemails from different unrecognized phone numbers. Then a text as well. Pick up the phone. My full name. Well, that was alarming. Immediately I took screenshots and had my boyfriend call from his phone. But no luck. I blocked the number and hoped that would be it. Maybe 30 minutes later, I get 5 calls from a brand new number and a new, even more alarming set of texts. "I'm a 40-year-old man and I am in love with you. I'll keep trying to reach you until you respond. I won't stop." I immediately blocked the number and called my parents. Within 2 minutes, he'd made a new number and started texting me again. "Wow. I just want to talk to you for 5 minutes. I mean, I'll even pay you. But after that, consider me gone." Again blocked. I alerted my boss. Then the text stopped. After work, I filed a police report and bought a baseball bat and set up some security alarms as well in my apartment. My very first instinct was that it was a guy I had recently worked with who had just been fired for sexual harassment. One of my friends and coworkers was good at tech stuff and changed his phone number and texted the number, pretending to be me on a burner, to get some information out of the person. It was a bit of a long conversation. I'll sum it up by saying this guy basically wanted to talk to me on the phone while he jerked off. He called me 26 times and got no answer, so finally he stopped trying. We assumed that was going to be the end of it. Instead, the next morning I got a new text from a new number again. This time it was someone claiming to be one of my friend's fathers. I started to really freak out now. Both of my parents and my boyfriend were at work, so he sent his mom over to calm me down and stay with me while I was alone in my apartment. The person called my phone. His mom answered, and all he said in this super creepy, raspy voice was, "Please," then abruptly hung up. I was having a full-blown panic attack at this point, so she called the police department and had an officer come out to update my report. She was still texting the guy while the cop was there, and once she told him law enforcement had been contacted, the man's entire story changed. He said he didn't know me or anything about me, didn't even live near me, and meant no physical harm. Just a lonely guy who'd got my number from Facebook and decided to harass me. I might have remembered this wrong, but I could have sworn I had set my phone number to private. I know I had it up there because of two-step verification, but, well, I had recently posted something on the Facebook Marketplace, so I assume that's where he'd found it. I have deleted that account since and changed my phone number, and nothing else has happened. I'm posting this here more or less as a warning to anyone who has two-step verification set up. Please double-check right now and make sure you have the most private settings possible for everything. I'm not even going to set all that stuff up with my new phone number. I'm not going to risk giving it out anywhere online.
I've always wanted to post something on Let's Not Meet, because I've been reading posts on this subreddit since I was little. I can't say I'm too pleased to have an experience to post now that it's actually happened. I haven't really told anybody this story, because I didn't want to freak out any of my friends, so I've limited it to just my mom and a few close friends. Well, I suppose now you'll know. So, let's begin. So how my friend group works is that we have our little circle of people who we hang around with most often, but for big events or bonfires or something similar, we expand and a couple of different friend groups join one. Ben is a part of one of these extended friend groups. He's someone who always posts different and interesting things, who always has something to say. I've gotten along really well with Ben at these events, and we always end up chatting. I've always found him to be a different and unique individual. Ben started going to my local college this year. He shot me a Snapchat basically saying, "Hey, all my friends went away to different schools, and the only person I have to talk to from the area is now my ex-girlfriend. I was wondering if you wanted to get a group together maybe and hang out, because I'd like to have some new friends around." It was actually a really nice message, because with the course I'm in, I don't get to make many friends, and all my close friends are spread out now too, so I said yes. The hangout was initially supposed to be one of my friends, him, and one of his friends. It was a day after class, and I just got home. He told me he was going to take a quick nap before we all head out. When he wakes up, he tells me it's now too late, and he has other plans he forgot about. That's totally fine. I wasn't really upset about it. I canceled with my friend too, so I can just sit down and do some homework. He texted me a few hours later. I didn't give him my number. How did he find it? Telling me his other plans got canceled, and he was now available again. He wanted to know if I still wanted to do something. I said that my friend was now out of the city, and he said he texted his friend but they didn't answer. He decided to pick me up and go for a drive and just chat. Normal enough. Ben gets to my house at around 10. I go and hop into his car and he speeds off. Oddly enough, he's talking in a weirdly accented voice, kind of like Jamaican or something similar. I thought he was just trying to be goofy, so I played along. Sometimes I would answer back in the accent, But then I started to think how it was weird that he wasn't talking in his own voice at all. He was driving like a maniac down the street, telling me how he was drinking earlier because he thought he was going to a party. I asked him if he was drinking and driving, and then he said that he'd only had a few sips. I know I probably should have gotten out of the car then, but at this point we were flying down the highway, and I was pretty scared. He begins to rant about his ex, telling me that there was infidelity and trust issues on his end, and he couldn't tell me what they were because he didn't want me to think badly of him. He told me he was still going to marry this girl and have her children. He ranted about her and got on tangents and started to scream and yell. I started to think that he was probably on some drug or something. We arrived at my college, a half-hour to 40-minute drive away in another city, and he says we should get out of the car. I'm already scared and my phone is dying, so I just listen to what he says. At this point, I'm literally thinking he might kill me. He took me for a walk through the light woods, and then started to make sounds like a creature. It was weird. He would make like dinosaur sounds, or sounds like from The Grudge. He would also walk like a creature, morphing his body into these weird, creepy movements. I requested for us to go home right away because I was literally terrified. We get back into the car and start our drive home. He pulls out a pipe and smokes something. I told him he shouldn't do that while he was driving, but he just didn't listen. Now he begins to yell. He starts back on his tangents about life again. He pulls over the car to get out and do some jumping kicks. At this point, my phone is dead. He gets back into the car and puts on his favorite song. The song begins slow and then picks up a little later. It's about a 4-minute song. He begins to scream along with the lyrics and smash the windows and dashboard with his hands, stomping his feet around. I've seen someone passionate about a song before, but not like this. Ben swerves all around the road until we finally get to my house. Then he turns to me and says without an accent, "I know it's late, but did you want to have sex?" In the most casual tone in the world. I gave a nervous laugh and said, "Actually, I'm good." He turned to the back seat to get something, but I got out of my car and booked it into my house. I locked the door right away, and the bedroom door in my room, as if I thought he would break in or something. It might not sound as terrifying as it was for me in the moment, but at the time I was shaking out of pure fear. I don't know if he was just on some crazy drug or if he had a split personality or something, but I've never met a person before who I've looked at and thought to myself, "You are going to kill someone one day." I really hope he doesn't see this, because I actually see him at school quite frequently. So, yeah, what a fun life. So this happened a few months ago. I'm a sophomore in college and was traveling down to my hometown over break. I was having some relationship issues with my stepmom, so I didn't want to stay at my dad's house the night I arrived at my hometown. I phoned a friend of mine from high school to see if I could stay over at his place. I knew from social media that he was still in town, and I'd stayed at his place before, so I knew there would be a place for me if they could allow it. My friend, let's call him Z, seemed like a pretty normal dude. We weren't the best of friends or anything, but we got pretty close by the time we had graduated. We would occasionally text or hang out if I was in town and catch up with each other, reminisce on the times we spent in orchestra or English class. When I called, he seemed extremely enthusiastic. Z's a normally upbeat guy, but this time it seemed like he was getting ready to get a brand new car. I didn't really think about it at the time, and he said I could sleep in the guest room, so I headed right over. When I got to his house, he was just as excited as he had been on the phone. He was bringing up stuff to do, like getting high and watching weird movies, or just playing video games together. Z's parents weren't home, so he really wanted the opportunity to smoke. I was pretty tired from the drive, but since we rarely see each other, I thought a little bit of bonding time couldn't hurt. We played Smash Bros, smoked some weed, and just chatted for a few hours. It was longer than I had wanted, but I was having fun, so whatever, right? By the time it was getting late at around 2 a.m., he started asking some pretty weird questions. If I ever wondered what it was like to kill someone, or if I thought anyone would miss me when I was gone. This, along with some pretty normal questions like if I had a boyfriend, or how my parents were doing, or if I was making friends at school. They all gave me a weird feeling. I was confused in the moment, but it didn't hit me until after that Z could be assessing me for something bad. The weirdness of it all made me just want to go right to bed. We stopped the game and both went into the basement, where his room and the guest room were. We say goodnight. I go to my room and get ready for bed. I'm having a little trouble sleeping, just some insomnia that I've had for a while, so I stay awake for around an hour until I hear some slight movement outside my room. The walls were all pretty thin, so I could hear footsteps walking past my door and up the stairs to the main floor, then back down quickly after. What struck me as odd was that I didn't hear the basement door open. It creaks very loudly when it does. The light didn't turn on either, so I was confused what Z was doing. I heard him go back into his room, but I just had this odd feeling. Ever since I met him this night, he seemed to be a lot different than he's ever been. I decided to look him up on social media and Google to see if anything was out of the ordinary. Everything seemed normal, until I found his Tumblr, which was linked from his inactive Twitter account that I found on my Twitter contacts list. His Tumblr was, well, disturbing. There were graphic drawings of mutilated bodies of humans and animals, links to suspicious-looking websites that I didn't dare to click on, text posts and stories about murdering, cannibalism, necrophilia, and torture. There were also photos of guns, knives, and axes, which after looking closely were taken in his bedroom. The last post, around a week prior, was a text post from the account saying he wished he could find someone easy to kill like a homeless person. I was immediately filled with dread. I knew he was going to do something. He must have gone up the stairs to lock the door. I packed my things. Luckily, I had packed very lightly, and opened up this small window at the top of my bedroom's wall. I started to desperately climb through. As I was pulling my legs through, he opened the door. It was dark, but the streetlight illuminated enough for me to see he was carrying something long and skinny, probably a knife. He didn't say anything. I didn't either. I just turned around, hopped in my car, and drove as fast as I could to my dad's house. I immediately blocked him everywhere and reported his Tumblr account, but not before telling the police. They said they couldn't do anything, as the guns were legally registered under his dad and he hadn't actually done anything yet. Nevertheless, I told my other high school friends not to hang out with him. Ever since then, I've been creeped out whenever I meet new people. Just the realization that someone I knew so well could underneath be this person who could hurt me so bad, could want to kill me. I don't know what he's doing now, and I'm not sure I want to, but I hope he's getting some help. So this happened to me last semester. I'm a college student and I've only had positive experiences, except for this encounter I had throughout the entirety of the last semester. Just a disclaimer, this will probably be long, but I tried to space out the paragraphs for it to be easier to read. I'm a psychology major, and between taking AP classes in high school and taking a few extra classes over the summer, I'm already ahead of my class. Last summer I registered for a neuroscience course, which was a bit more advanced, and all the kids in the class were either juniors or seniors about to graduate. On the first day of class, I made my way to the classroom, and the professor was late. There was a big crowd of people outside, and I simply asked a boy if he was waiting for the same class. He said yes. He introduced himself to me as Braxton, and that was that. The professor came, and the class was pretty good. At the end of class, he asked me for my number, just in case we had to discuss homework assignments and whatnot, and I thought he would be a cool connection to have. Boy, was I wrong. I saw him about twice a week for an hour and a half. Not even 2 weeks after I met him, only seeing him in class, he stated that he felt a connection to me, and that I was the most beautiful and fascinating girl he had ever met. I ignored the connection part of it and thanked him for his compliment. That was that. The week after he mentioned this, he had texted me asking me out of nowhere if I had anxiety. I hesitantly said yes and kept it very broad. I told him that large crowds of people are my biggest trigger, but I managed just fine. He made it a point to tell me that if I ever needed to escape, he knew a few spots that were vacant and deserted. I told him I was fine, and he seemed to drop it. The week after, we said our goodbyes, and I started walking to my next class. Usually we say goodbye, and I don't see him until class 2 days later. He turned around quickly and started walking next to me. I told him that I was fine and that he could go to his own class. He said, No, it's fine. I want to walk you to math. I know people scare you." I stopped dead in my tracks and asked him how he knew I had math class after our NS class. He told me not to worry about it. As much as I was weirded out, I decided to ignore it. Keep in mind, I never once told him my schedule, or really anything about myself. He dropped me off, and I felt relief thinking that was that. I brushed it off as him just trying to be a little gentleman. An hour and a half later, he was waiting for me right outside the room and then said, "Let's get you to English." I lied and told him that my English class had been canceled, and alarms had gone off in my head. Apparently this kid knew my whole schedule, and where classes were located and what times. Although I again ignored it because I didn't want to be rude to him, I took it as him trying to be nice, so I tried to forget about it. After that incident, everything seemed to return to normal, until it wasn't. As stated earlier, I have some pretty bad anxiety, and on this day in particular I was having a pretty off day. Class started and I grew more and more anxious and had to step out, so I did. I went to the bathroom and calmed myself down, and returned quietly, only to notice that Braxton was not in his seat. He came back soon after and took his seat right behind me, and immediately whispered in my ear, "Don't you ever leave without my permission again. Do you understand me?" I just nodded and apologized so he would stop, and then he returned back to normal. One of his few obsessions with me was that something would happen to me, and that he had to protect me at all costs. If I wasn't okay, he would flip out and do anything in his power to return me to an okay state. It was odd. There were a few instances in which it got really freaky. One of these instances was the day he noticed my medical bracelet for hypoglycemia. As soon as he noticed it, he started interrogating me about why I had it, what it was, if I take medications, when was my last episode. He then proceeded to grab my hand to try and snap a picture of my parents' phone numbers on the back. I told him it wasn't his business, and if he really needed that information one day he would have it, on my wrist. He got upset but dropped it. That Friday he had called me from his job. He worked at a hospital doing office-type work, and said, "Hey, I have you on speaker, and I'm with one of my colleagues. I need you to explain your condition, why it happens, and give me a list of medications you take." I told him that it was completely out of line, and hung up on him. He blew up my phone telling me how important it was to get help, and how important it was for him to know everything about it. I started ignoring him. The next time I saw him, he acted normal and even apologized for his actions. We moved on until the next thing. I had twisted my ankle pretty bad on campus, and I had been crying. It was pretty obvious I was in pain and stressed. As soon as he saw me, he completely flipped out, asking who did this to me, if I was okay, if I needed medications. He demanded he was going to take me to the university clinic. He told me I wasn't allowed to call my mother, and that only he could deal with this. I told him that he didn't control me, and I ended up calling my mom, obviously, where she told me to go to the clinic and that she would pick me up there. I told Braxton that we could just get an escort by the campus police. The clinic was a few blocks away, and he immediately shut that down and got extremely upset. No, we are absolutely not going to the police. I'm gonna get an Uber, but we're not going to the police. Don't you even think about calling them. This was extremely alarming to me because why did he want to stay away from the police so badly? He ended up calling an Uber and we got to the clinic finally. He insisted on being right by my side the entire time and wanted me to hold his hand. He kept trying to rub my back and touch me. I told him to stop and that I didn't want him touching me and for him to just leave. He insisted on staying. There wasn't really much I could do, so I dealt with it until my mother came to get me. I was extremely tense and kept my hands to myself and just sat still. After I left, he followed up with multiple texts, asking if I was okay and if I could keep him updated. I ignored all of his messages. Towards the end of the semester, a mutual friend we had in that class messaged me, asking if Braxton had ever made me feel uncomfortable. I told her the truth, and the multiple instances that I immediately got bad vibes from him. Not even 5 minutes after I sent the message to her, Braxton starts blowing up my phone. Calling, texting, leaving voicemails. He kept threatening me, saying he was going to find me, and as soon as he did, that it was over for me. He said I had ruined his life, and that he hated me and that I was a horrible person. He was going to show me what I deserved the next time he saw me, and that I had no idea what was coming for me. His voicemails were so full of rage. His voice was even shaking because of how angry he was, and he was yelling his heart out on one voicemail, and in the next sobbing about why I didn't love him back, how I could betray him like this. Obviously, I didn't go to school that day, and his hundreds of voicemails and texts alternated between rage and apologies, and every emotion in between. It was terrifying. The only reason I did not block this guy or tell anyone about him was because I was terrified he would do something to me. He would remind me that if I was scared of him now, he would give me a reason to be scared later, either if I went to the police or tried distancing myself more. He found every single one of my study spots. I'm a commuter, so I would study and stay at many different coffee shops, and if I wasn't at the ones I usually stayed at, he would message me saying that he would find me if I didn't tell him where I was. He told me that if I ever went to the police that he would give me a reason not to, things like that. He also shared with me that he would fantasize about me and how badly he wanted me. He said he loved the way I smelled and even wanted to take pieces of my hair to keep at home. It was awful. At the very end of the semester, I completely stopped talking to him, and he seemed to have gotten the hint. I moved seats in class, and he didn't seem to bother me after I made it evident I wanted nothing to do with him. In the last week of semester, he started to take pictures of me from across campus and send them to me with multiple numbers. He would say things like, "You're gorgeous today. I love you so much. I just wish you loved me back. You'll pay for this. Your betrayal to me and humankind." On the very last day, I had gotten on my commuter bus and was seated and on my way home. I got a text from him with a video of me getting onto the bus that said, "See you soon, darling." I was paranoid for weeks afterwards. Luckily, nothing had ever happened since then. He never texted me again, and I hadn't seen him at all after last semester. He deleted all of his social medias. Hopefully he moved away or graduated. Honestly, I just hope he is far, far away. The other night, I was driving in the center lane of a 3-lane city street. All of a sudden, a car comes up into my right blind spot and almost slams into me. I look over and it's swerving in and out of the lane, braking abruptly. I honk and I look over to see if the driver is possibly distracted, and I see that the man is driving while drinking something out of a brown bottle. The man then comes up to my side and is screaming at the top of his lungs. Not wanting to get involved in this whole situation, I made a lane change to the leftmost lane to try and get away from the man. I could still hear him screaming, so I turn on my rear view camera and I see the man swerve across 2 lanes from the rightmost to get behind me. He starts speeding up as if he's trying to ram me from behind. Once I see him inches from my bumper, I decided to run the red light I'm stopped at and make a right turn in front of the 2 lanes of traffic beside me in the hopes that he'll just leave me alone. I look at my rear view camera again, and I can see that the man is following me, trying to hit me from behind yet again. I panicked. I sped off on a side street, but I looked back to see he just wouldn't let up. He was swerving in the lanes behind me, trying to keep up. In the distance, I saw a freeway on-ramp, so I decided to speed over in hopes of losing him on the freeway. The on-ramp has 2 lanes that merge into one. I pass a car prior to the merge, thinking that car will create a buffer between me and the man chasing me. When I look back into my camera, I see that the man is driving in the shoulder, on the brush to the right side of the on-ramp, in order to pass the other car and catch up to me. At this point, I was driving close to 100 miles per hour, scared for my life, so I slow down and dial 911. I explain the situation to the dispatcher, and she recommends that I try to get away to safety. The man caught up to me, though, and begins coming up to the right side of me on the freeway. He repeatedly tries to swerve his car into me, as if to ram me or run me off the road. I slow down in the hopes that he'll pass me up, but he slows down too, and his wife in the passenger seat throws a bottle at my car. For a second I lose visibility. The car is covered in a brown, foamy liquid. I think to myself, surely this is the extent of his road rage. I look over and it seems as if he's continuing on the freeway. Ready to get away, I pull off onto the next freeway exit, thinking I can now just leave the situation. As I do this, the man sees me and makes a 4-lane change onto the exit ramp and tries to ram me once again at the freeway exit. I'm then forced to speed through the city streets, and I finally end up at a red light trapped next to the man. I look over at the man and roll down my window. He's screaming at me. "Why the fuck do you honk at me, you bitch? Are you trying to make me look like a bad father in front of my kids? You want to go?" His wife was also yelling at me, saying, "Why would you honk at him in front of my kids?" I look into the back seat, and I see 2 children in car seats. Since I'm on speaker with the dispatcher, she hears all of this and tells me to just try to get away. At this point I was done. I just want to get away from this man. So I make a U-turn to head back onto the freeway. He follows me once again, and almost hits a plastic construction lane barrier to do so. He's still trying to hit me from behind. Once I get onto the overpass to get onto the freeway, I glance at him to the side of me and see he's holding something up in my direction. Suddenly I hear a very loud bang. In that moment, the dispatcher on the phone yells, "Did he shoot you? Are you okay?" Thinking I've been shot, I start screaming that he's going to kill me. Realizing that running away isn't working, I stop and the man speeds off. Luckily there's no broken glass and I'm not injured in any way. The dispatcher tells me to pull off to a nearby safe location, so I go to the parking lot of a nearby mall. I tell the dispatcher the make, color, and model of the car, as well as a partial license plate. The whole time I drive there, I was concerned that the man could be following me again, but they sent an officer over immediately to file a police report. In waiting for the officer, I realized that my car's cameras are always recording, so I hit the save button. The officer comes over and I tell him my story, describing everything in detail. I also tell him that I may have footage of the whole thing. We take a walk around my car, and for the most part there's no damage. The officer then informs me that because I'm not injured, and because there's no damage to the car, there isn't really anything that can be done. I ask him if it was an assault. He says because the bottle hit my car and not me, that it's not. I ask him if it's reckless driving. He says that here in California, that's only a misdemeanor, and that it requires the presence of a CHP officer to convict. I then ask him if it could be considered an attempted murder, because he was trying to ram me, but he says that this is just plain old road rage and there's not much that can be done. At most, the officer says that once he has a complete license plate, an officer can go out and talk to him, I guess. I ask him if the potential footage could be helpful in getting this man reprimanded in some way, and he only tells me to send me the highlights and necessary screenshots. At the end of all this, I'm extremely shaken up. I eventually went home and reviewed the footage captured by my car. Luckily, I have the entire thing recorded. The moment he almost hits me, his wife throwing the bottle, his face as he's yelling at me and his license plate, even him trying to ram me. It's all recorded. A few days later, the officer called me and confirmed the license plate I had in the video. A week and a half has passed, and there's been no update. While I understand that the law is the law, it's unacceptable to me that this man could be so overtly aggressive on the road, threatening my life and the lives of his children and the lives of everyone else on the road, with no sort of punishment. I was genuinely scared for my life, and in the process both he and I endangered the others on the road. Ultimately, this has left me feeling very disappointed with the system. An act of violence was committed, and due to technicalities the other driver gets off. I tried to keep my retelling as factual as possible, but honestly it was a really terrifying experience. Even in the past few days I still feel a bit hesitant to be an aggressive driver, and I'm not comfortable honking. I really wish I could say this didn't get to me, but it has. One odd detail is that the man was taking pictures of my car before the bang happened. What could that possibly be for? First time posting, so play nice. This is 100% true, and I wanted to post it for a while, but I guess I was too scared until recently. This happened a couple of years ago now, but it's easily the scariest I've ever been through. I was doing my second year of my degree, so I worked at a well-known fast food restaurant. I don't want to get sued or whatever, but y'all are probably familiar with it. I was pretty good at my job, not that it was particularly difficult. I started off doing day shifts, which is when most of the staff worked. Places like that are a revolving door employment-wise. I worked there for 7 months, and I may as well have been a lifer. While working there, I worked for a time alongside a dude named Frank. Frank was older than me. I was 20 at the time, and I guessed he was in his early 30s. He had a pleasant-ish demeanor most of the time, but the dude was dumb as a pole. He constantly did things wrong, and was absolutely frustrating most of the time. More than that, though, he was just kind of weird. He just did weird things that didn't make sense to anyone but him. Because of this, I barely spoke to him unless I absolutely had to, and I wasn't all that bummed out when they decided to fire him. As far as I knew, that would be the last I ever saw of him, and I was pretty indifferent about it, other than the vague relief that I wouldn't have to work with someone incompetent again. A few months went on, and I was eventually moved to the morning shift. We're talking about 5 a.m. to 12 p.m. It sucked, but it meant I had afternoons free most of the time, which meant I could get ahead with university work. I generally only worked weekends, and any weekday that I didn't have university. At the time the story happened, I'd already found a new job, and I was on my final day of working for this fast food place. I actually had my first shift at the new place at 4 p.m. that day. I wasn't planning to work, but my manager begged me to train the new girl, and I agreed. I'd still have a couple of hours to change and nap after my shift, so I guessed it was no big deal. The day fell on a Wednesday, which I never usually worked, and I wasn't rotated to work on it. That's important to remember. So I get to the store at 5 a.m. and start training the new girl as usual. Everything is going pretty chill, and as per usual up until about 7 a.m. I look over the counter and see a familiar face. There was a line of customers, but he wasn't standing in it, more like next to it. I gave a brief, "Hi, Frank," and turned back to what I was doing. We weren't friends, and had barely ever spoken. I hadn't seen him in about 6 months, so I didn't want to have to give him any more of my time. The dude kept lingering there, though. He asked me how I was, and I said fine and asked him back. He said he'd found a new job, and I sort of nodded, but I was serving customers, and to be honest, I didn't really want to keep up a conversation. Then the really weird stuff began. He asked me if I wanted to hang out sometime, to which I snorted and said no. The woman I was serving gave an amused smile, which I returned. Frank wasn't sated, though. He asked again, and when I said no, he asked why. I said that I had a partner and that I was busy. He asked what I was busy with. I said that I was going to my hometown, which was true. I was going to do that after my shift at my new place, to see my mom. He asked what was there and why I was going. Frustrated, I told him that I was busy and that I needed to get back to work. It's been a couple of years, and honestly this was pretty traumatic, so I don't fully remember the events that happened next. What I do remember is that suddenly he started acting really weird. He was staring at me with wide eyes, like he didn't know what was going on. He walked around to the employee door and tried to go in. At that point, I ran over and held my hands up to him, not touching him, pointedly not touching him. I told him he couldn't come back here and that he had to leave right away. He was sweating by now and staring at me. He sort of mumbles something, sounding like he's agreeing with me, and even steps back a little. I tell him that he has to leave, that he has to go right now. One of the other customers sees this and says firmly, "Are you going to leave or what?" To which Frank nods but makes no move to actually go. He just stands there shaking. The problem with working in crappy places is that nothing works, so the employee door didn't lock. I closed the door anyway, and moved back so I was on the stairs up to the office, so I could see the CCTV feed. I look at the feed from the one pointed at the employee door, and he's just standing there staring at the door, unmoving. Meanwhile, the new girl is still serving customers, by the way. I was scared, so I texted my manager, who told me she was on her way, and just to hold tight. He was still standing there, so I asked her if it was okay to head up to the office, which she said was fine. It wasn't too busy, and honestly I wouldn't care if it was, so I head upstairs to the office. Just as I get there, I hear the voice of the new girl shouting, "Wait! Stop! You can't go up there!" And holy shit, I turn around and see Frank, dazed out of his mind, crawling up the stairs towards me. His eyes are wild, and he looks completely out of it. Once again, I hold up my hands and tell him to leave, but this time he seems completely incapable of listening. He just keeps walking towards me. I tell my manager in all caps, he's upstairs. Remember what I said about working in crappy places? Nothing works, which meant the door to the office didn't lock either. As he approached me, I slammed the door shut and pressed my back up against it. I was hoping that because he seemed so strung out, I didn't know if it was drugs or just some sort of mental break, he would just leave, but he didn't. The dude starts pushing on the door, grunting and moaning, and I felt like I was 100% in a horror movie. At this point, I just decide to call the police. I'm screaming on the phone to this girl, shaking. I've never had to call any sort of emergency services before or since, so the whole thing was just terrifying to me. And bear in mind, he's pushing and slamming on the door as I'm doing all this. She's asking me if I know what he wants, or if he has a weapon, and it dawns on me suddenly that I have no idea. As soon as the dispatch girl hangs up, I hear my manager's voice talking very firmly and sternly to Frank. From what I can tell, he sounds like he's sort of responding to her. I call out that I've called the police, and I don't move from the door. I hear the police soon enough, and they convince him to come downstairs. As he's going, he asks softly if I can come, at which point I scream, "What the hell?" because that was the last straw. Soon enough, a police officer knocks on the door and tells me they've taken him outside. He comes in and takes my statement. He tells me that all they could do was let him go since he didn't break the law. They said he didn't seem to be on drugs either. I'm scared, but I'm just sort of glad he's gone. You'd think that's where the ordeal ends, but apparently Frank had a little prequel in mind for me. After this whole thing, I grab my phone to text my partner, and I notice I've got a new email. I check it, and it's from about 6:30 that morning, from Frank. I don't remember all that was said, but it was essentially saying hello, asking how I was. He asked in the email if I'd like to go out sometime, and that I'd had a great impact on his life. I show my manager, and she guesses that he got my email from one of the email threads she used to send with the rotas attached. Remember earlier, though, how I said I hadn't been rotated to work on this day? That I never worked on Wednesdays? That he left before I started the early shifts. There was, in theory, no way he would know that I would be there, and yet somehow he did. I passed this info on to the police, who told me they still couldn't do anything, but that if I ever saw him in public again, even if he wasn't doing anything, to call them right away. I called my new workplace and very briefly explained the situation. They were nice and said I didn't have to come in that day, and that they hoped I was okay. My partner brought me home and helped calm me down while I sat, terrified and paranoid in my bed, until I eventually made my way back to my mom's place, which was far enough away that I felt safe. I eventually moved out of that town, but only 2 months ago. Up until then, I saw him everywhere I went, and I feared what would happen every time I saw him. Thankfully, up until now, I never have. I'm a girl. My mom was a horrible addict. She barely took care of me as a child. At the time of this incident, I was around 6 or 7, so my awareness and understanding of things happening may not totally make much sense. This all happened in the 90s. One night, my mother and I were on a car ride. I wasn't sure why we were driving, but it was late at night. I'm not sure what time it was either, but I assume it was very late because there weren't any cars on the street, and I was sleeping in the back seat. I don't even remember getting into the car. My mom drove up to some sketchy house and left me in the car for what felt like forever. Suddenly, the car door swung open, and someone violently grabbed me by the arm and yanked me out of the car. I started screaming and crying until the man that had grabbed me looked me in the eyes and said, "Be quiet, and don't try to run or I'll kill you." He had a scruffy beard and looked just like a madman. I was scared to death, so I listened. He held me tight by the arm, shut the car door, and walked with me down the street. I looked back at the house my mom was in, hoping that my mom would come out at the last second and save me. I looked at the house as long as I could, as the man dragged me further and further away. As we walked down the street, I wanted to cry, but I was in shock and fear. I didn't know what to do. If I sniffled or cried at all, the man would tighten his grip and yell at me. I can't even explain how scared and confused I was. We walked for a little while, and finally ended up in the projects. The projects were a bunch of buildings crammed together in a shitty neighborhood. We walked into one of the buildings, and started to walk up a flight of stairs. My legs and feet hurt like hell at this point, but I was too scared to stop moving or complain. We walked up another flight of stairs, when I saw a random man smoking a cigarette in the stairway. Then, without warning, the guy that kidnapped me fell to the ground. It happened so fast. I didn't know how the kidnapper fell to the ground so fast, but the next thing I remember is the cigarette man was punching and kicking the kidnapper in his head and face. The kidnapper was out cold. The cigarette man picked up the kidnapper by the back of his jacket and threw him straight down the stairs. You have no idea how scary and violent it is to see an unconscious man fall down the stairs. To this day, I still have a fear of them. He bled everywhere. I have no idea how the man with the cigarette knew to help me, but I'm glad he did. Maybe he could see the tears in my eyes. Maybe he just picked up on something and had a bad vibe, but he acted instantly. The first second he could, he attacked my would-be kidnapper. The cigarette man started pacing back and forth, swearing at himself and gritting his teeth, clenching his fists together. I thought he was mad at me, so I started to cry. He looked at me and said, Okay, shut up. He had an attitude to him, so I listened to him out of fear. I wasn't as scared of this man as much as the bearded guy, but I still was afraid. He started to ask me questions with a bit of an attitude. Why are you out this late? Where are your parents? Why would you even talk to strangers? I was in so much shock and confusion, I couldn't answer the man's questions correctly. He asked me if I knew my way home, and I told him that I didn't. I told him a broken story about what happened, and somehow with the information I gave him, he knew where my mom's car was. The only thing I remember about the road is passing a house with Christmas lights on it, despite Christmas already being over. I think he knew the area well enough, and figured out where I needed to go from that information, but I honestly don't ever remember telling him about the Christmas lights. Anyways, he promised he would take me back if I promised over and over that I wouldn't tell the police that I saw him, or anyone that looked like him, and made me promise that I wouldn't even tell the police anything. He had an attitude, and I didn't care what he asked me. I just wanted to go back to my mom, so I agreed. I followed him down the stairs. The bearded man was still laying on the ground bleeding out at the bottom of the stairs. He wasn't moving at all. For all I know, he was dead, and I kind of hope he was. The cigarette man stepped over the bearded guy, and I followed. He walked outside, and he looked a bit panicky. I remember him telling me over and over, "The police don't like me." We walked out of the projects, and my feet still hurt a bit. The man was walking fast in a panic, and I had to basically jog to keep up with him. I started crying, and he asked me what was wrong. I told him my feet hurt, and I remember him sucking his teeth and picking me up. He awkwardly cradled me in both arms. He walked down the road for a moment. Then I remember him swearing and running behind a house or a building. A cop car was driving down the road. He put me down and told me to run to the police car. I tried to run, but my legs could barely move, and I was scared. The car kept driving and rode away without seeing me, before I could even remotely get close to it. He kept swearing to himself as he picked me up again and ran down the street. He took me behind a lot of houses and hid from every cop car that drove by. I assume now that the police were looking for me. He carried me in both arms, running fast down the road, when I saw my mom in her car in the distance. She was surrounded by police. The man put me down and told me to go over to her. I got so excited the pain in my legs disappeared. He put me down and ran away in the other direction. I ran towards the police and my mom. My mom picked me up and hugged me tight. The police started to ask me and my mom questions. I don't remember too much about their questions, but I remember my mom telling the police some convoluted story that didn't make any sense. She basically told me not to say anything, and I didn't say much but cried a whole bunch. We went home. Days later, my dad picked me up and knew right away that something was wrong. I told him everything that had happened, and I never lived with my mom again. When I grew up, I had time to think about that day. I never forgave my mother. Not too long ago, I asked my dad what he remembers about the situation, and he told me what he thinks happened from what I explained to him from years ago. He said my mom was on a drug binge. I got kidnapped and someone saved me, but the person that saved me had warrants out for him. He wasn't mad at me. He was just frustrated with the situation that he had to deal with. Imagine being a criminal on the run, and now you have a kidnapped girl with you, and you just beat a guy half to death. If he would have gotten caught with me, he could be in jail for my kidnapping. With my mom lying and me being in shock and confused, I wouldn't be able to tell them that the man had helped me, because while it was all happening, I didn't even notice that he was. So, to the man that saved me, thanks. I was watching my daughter's kids while she and her husband go out of town. They have a teenage daughter. Let's say her name is Alyssa. At about 3 a.m., I'm woken up by a weird rustling sound, and I look out the window and see movement. I saw a boy emerge from the bushes on the side of the house. I saw a bike tossed on the lawn that definitely wasn't ours. My first thought was that it was a burglar casing houses, but since he looked to be young and came on a bike, I figured scaring him straight would be enough for him to decide to head home. I didn't want to ruin a teenager's life by calling the cops straight away. So I went out on the porch, flipped the lights on and said, "Can I help you?" in my classroom voice. The guy looked surprised but not nervous. He was wearing a Letterman-style jacket, but once I got a clear view of him in the streetlights, he seemed much older than my granddaughter. Gruff, and more wiry than athletic. He walked up closer to the house and said, "Yeah, I'm looking for Alyssa." I gave him a disapproving glare, hoping he'd realize he came looking for a girl late at night, and a grumpy old person answered, "It's time to split." I'm thinking what must have happened is Alyssa knew her parents were going out of town, and maybe before she knew I'd be staying over, told a secret older boyfriend to come on over. It was late and I was alone with several kids, so I didn't want him coming any closer to the house. I also thought it was weird he came so late, and wanted to be sure Alyssa actually wanted to talk to him. So I said, "I'm sorry, who?" And he said Alyssa. You know, Alyssa, and then her last name. This is her house. I thought he knew her full name, so they must at least be friends. I told him to wait there. He started to walk up, and I felt a sickening burning in my gut. Instinct kicked in, and I yelled, "No, stop!" Then I readjusted and said, "Stay right there. This is a private property, so don't take a step closer. Wait there." I go in, and Alyssa is asleep just one room over from where the rustling first occurred. I wake her up and say something to the effect of, "I don't know what the big idea was to have friends over this time of night, but you tell them to go home." She has no clue what I'm talking about. I say, "There's a man outside waiting for you." She gets confused, gets up and goes to the window. She sees him and goes as white as a sheet. "He asked for me?" "Yeah." "By name?" "Yes." "Call the police. I've never seen that man before in my life." I called 911 immediately, but as I was on the phone with them, Alyssa started tugging on my arm. He's coming up." I had younger kids in the house to think about, so I kept the door latched and pulled it just open enough for the latch. I yelled. I asked my husband, and none of us know this person. Leave my property now or I'm calling 911. He got angry and started yelling for her to come out. Thankfully, the police came pretty quickly, and when he heard the sirens, he grabbed his bike and ran off. I watched where he was running to, and he jumped into the passenger side of a car without headlights or front plates and sped right off. The police followed in the same direction once I pointed them out, but they didn't get him. They advised us to take all her social media details offline if she was sure she didn't know this person, and said they'd had a couple similar reports recently and were looking into the problem. I got a heavy-duty lock, and she slept in my room for the remainder of my visit. So in my life, there have only been a few times I've ever looked back and thought I really could have been killed or something. This is one of them. It was back in 2010, when I had just started college. I had arrived pretty early, as I figured traffic would be much worse than it turned out to be. To kill some time, I decided to go to a Walmart right across the street. After shopping some Magic the Gathering and buying some food, I made my way out, and once I stepped off the curb, a man stopped me. This guy was probably between his late 30s and early 40s, and very unkempt looking. Ripped jeans that looked old, a shirt that was faded and looked like it had once had a design or writing on it, and a baseball cap that appeared to be the only new thing he had on. Once he stopped me, he started up with, "Hey man, I hate to be a bother, but I was doing some construction work up the road, and my truck ran out of gas. Can you help me out and drive with me to the nearest gas station? I'm alone and pretty desperate." Obviously that seemed pretty sketchy, so I instead offered to give him $10 I had on me, thinking it might really be a guy down on his luck. To my surprise, he immediately shot down my offer, and instead continued to insist I instead let him drive me to the gas station in his truck, pay for his gas, and then he'd drive me back. Needless to say, this all seemed incredibly bizarre, and I told him no and that I was in a hurry. Instead of leaving it alone, he began to tell me, "Man, come on. I'm all alone here and my truck is on E. I'm stranded here by myself." When I continued to walk away, he began to try to grab at my arm while continuing to beg. I realized quickly that with the way we were positioned, every time he went to grab at me and I walked away, he was leading me more and more away from the store and more toward the parking lot, which was not very full this early in the morning. Not wanting to let him keep leading me away, I walked back toward the store and said I had forgotten something inside. Instead of following me, he quickly backed off once I made it to the doors. I think he didn't want to go inside and risk other people seeing him. This may sound like overreacting, but at this point I was freaking out. I had never had someone actually try and grab me like that, and every bad scenario was running in my head. Not wanting him to do this with anyone else, I alerted the front desk of what was going on, and they told me they'd handle it. Honestly, I don't know if they did or didn't, because I quickly went for the other exit and nearly ran for my car. Once I was finally in my car, I noticed that the man was walking away from his spot, and I assumed they had either kicked him out or he was simply admitting defeat for the day. I was curious, so I watched him walk to the back of the parking lot and get in his truck. My heart sank when he pulled away, and I noticed two heads pop up from the back seats, as if they were hiding out of view until the car was moving. To make matters even more sketchy, he did not pull into the nearest gas station, and instead continued on and pulled onto the highway. Obviously not something someone alone and running out of gas would do. Fast forward 2 days later, and I stop at the same Walmart, And what do I find? Yup, it was him. Still there, and still giving the same story about being stranded and needing someone to follow him. This time, instead of telling the store, I immediately called the police. I don't know if he recognized me and saw me on the phone or what, but he left pretty immediately after that, and I never saw him in that parking lot again. Sorry if it's not as interesting as some of the other stories, but this is easily one of the scariest moments in my life. When I say he was trying to grab at me, I mean he was trying very hard. Like if he had grabbed me, he wasn't gonna let go. I don't know what he was planning, but I assume he figured a Walmart near a college would be an easy area to trick naive college kids. This happened when I was 11. I was living in the US at the time with my parents. We had bought a nice big house in a nice neighborhood, giant backyard and all. We'd been living at this particular house for about 6 months, so we'd well and truly settled into the place. I got my first dog and everything. As a kid, this was a real highlight in my life. One day when I came home from school, my mom took me aside as soon as I had arrived at home. She needed to tell me something, so she sat me down. Turns out when my dad arrived home from work, he noticed one of our garden chairs had been taken from our back garden and brought around to one of the side windows at the front, which happened to be my parents' bedroom window. After checking it out, someone had removed about half of the ceiling that held the window in its frame. With the chair still at the scene, it was concluded that whoever it had been had gotten spooked, likely by my dad getting up in the middle of the night, and whoever it was had bolted. Pretty scary stuff, knowing that someone had tried to get into one of our windows. Not even an open or unlocked window at that. The motherfucker tried to take the actual window out. When it came to things like this, my mom had a great way of speaking to me like an adult without scaring me. So while I was cautious, I wasn't too worried. She ended up taking a few new hobbies, like meeting me off the bus and checking in on me in the middle of every night. I'm an only child and was a pretty independent kid, so this was a bit strange, but I understood her reasoning. We figured it was an attempt at petty theft, so we left it at that. Besides, what could happen, really? My dad was a pretty big dude, and I had this awesome new guard dog. I felt very safe. Over the course of the next few weeks, a few of our neighbors were broken into and burglarized, in amongst a few attempts at our house. So we had a thief on our hands. In that time, my dad stepped up home security. A few motion lights here and an extra lock there. About a week passed before it happened again. My mom could hear someone walking around outside on the side of the house, so she crept up and tried to sneak a look. She couldn't see anything, so she went around the house looking through each window. She knew someone was there, but she just couldn't catch a glimpse of him. This was the catalyst that started a month from hell. In order to keep this from getting too long, I'll summarize what happened up until the night we caught this prick. My mom became a wreck. She moved herself into the spare room at the front of the house so she could see out the bigger window and be nearer to my room. Sometimes she'd sleep in the living room because you could see both the living room and kitchen windows. She always had a golf club with her, lost sleep, and her work suffered. During this time, my dad wasn't exactly the hero we'd all expect. He's a dead heavy sleeper, and chalked it all up to my mom being paranoid. One evening, when she could hear the creep, she tried to wake him up, and he promptly went back to sleep. Great effort, Dad. By this point in my life, I had become a night owl. I'd stay up until late to watch Adult Swim and chill with my dog. One night at about 1:30 a.m., I was sitting in my room doing just that. Suddenly, Jeffrey had this deep, menacing rumble coming from him. He'd been with us for a while by this time, and I'd never heard anything quite like this. I asked him what was up, and he just carried on with this alien noise, staring dead center at one of my windows, as if he could see through the damn thing. The blinds were drawn, so I sat, silently freaking out, imagining what was on the other side of that wall, and how it was making my dog do this. Not 1 minute later, I heard my mom scream at the top of her lungs, and I quote, "What the fuck? Yeah, I've seen you now, fucker." Time pretty much stopped then and there. I don't know if it was my kid imagination, but I shit you not, in that moment, Jeffrey and I looked at each other, both mouth agape and frozen by what we heard. I don't really remember getting up and running through the hall to my living room, but I got there just in time to see my sweet little mum fly out that fucking door with her trusty golf club, chasing this motherfucker down like Usain Bolt chasing the gold. I've never seen her move so fast. By this time, my dad had decided to wake up enough to come through to take the reins and call the police. Jeff had bolted out the door after my mom, and at one point caught up with her before she stopped at the end of the street. She was screaming anything and everything at this point, from "I'll get you" to "you're fucking done," to incoherent messes. I watched like a drone as she came back to the house, dog in tow, and I just sat down on the couch, entirely unsure of what had just happened. She took the phone and gave them a perfect description. He had been walking around the front of the house where she was in the spare room. By this point, we'd installed motion lights. This guy just wouldn't let up. Autumn was upon us, and leaves were falling, so she heard the crunch outside. She timed it perfectly to get a good look at the guy. After a month, she finally saw him past that window when she happened to be looking out, and his face was flooded with light from the new motion light situated by the window. Apparently he heard her when she screamed, and paused like a deer caught in literal headlights. He looked dead straight into the window before taking off down the road. It took about 5 minutes for the police to arrive. A few cars had been dispatched, one of them to us and the rest out to the neighboring streets. 10 minutes later, one of them got a call to say they got him. Soon he was parked up on the street in a cruiser, so my mom could identify him, and sure enough, it was him. They grabbed him a few streets up from our house. This is the part that makes my stomach turn. Turns out he wasn't just the persistent klepto we had believed. I was standing by the front door when I heard through one of the officer's radios, "Insert name, registered sex offender." I was a bit naive at this point. I kind of got what that meant, but it wasn't until I was older and was talking to my mom about it that a few more details came about. Unbeknownst to me, my mom was very much aware of what had happened with this guy. Turns out he'd been convicted of raping a 12-year-old girl. I'm not sure how long he was in for, but at some point he managed to get out and moved into one of the houses a few streets over from us, coincidentally in viewpoint of where I'd get on and off the school bus. He was on parole, and so was promptly thrown back in jail immediately. And this is where my knowledge of him ends, and I've never wanted to pursue knowing anything more. Even worse, one of our family friends that lived on the same street as him had received a letter to say he was registered and staying in our area. I shit you not, we were within a 3-minute walk from our house. We saw this woman so often, we still don't really get how or why she had never thought to bring it up. She had 2 kids herself. We ended up moving to the UK 2 months later for reasons unrelated. I won't lie, that time was pretty stressful. We didn't feel entirely comfortable in our own home anymore, and moving to another country kind of wrecked me at that age. Once we started our new life here, I didn't think much of it after that. I had bigger issues. This guy was persistent, but he was in jail, and wasn't going to be able to travel to the UK to get me. I was rational about my fear of him, so I found it easy to move on at that time. I thought about it a lot more the older I've gotten, so I guess this is more cathartic than anything else. So these incidents started about 6 years ago, and went on for a couple of years. I used to be really into the music scene, going to shows and festivals every chance I got. This often meant meeting random people, whose names I would forget about 5 seconds later. As a result of being out in Atlanta nightlife so often, I got frequent requests on Facebook, and a naive younger me blindly accepted them, assuming they were just people I had met at shows that I was too drunk or distracted to remember. One day, I got a message from someone named Eddie. His Facebook profile picture was of someone at least a decade older than me, with long, scraggly hair. He looked harmless enough, just another show-going hippie, I assumed. His message simply asked if I was the girl that danced a half-circle around him at the local show last night and then twirled dreamily away, or something along those lines. This was way back in 2012, so I don't remember the exact words. I responded that I had no recollection of that, and upon further investigation, I saw that he lived in an entirely different state, so it couldn't have been me. He told me that I must have had a doppelganger out there somewhere, and I left the conversation at that. Over the next few months, I'd get random notifications that he had messaged me, asking if I'd be at various shows across the southeast and the like. I mostly ignored the messages, but would very occasionally respond, shortly expressing interest in a band he had mentioned. I was just trying to be polite. Why the younger me felt the need to be polite to everyone is beyond me. I've since learned that it's okay to not respond to persistent internet strangers. The messages became more and more frequent, so I just started to leave them unread. Again, why I didn't block him is beyond me. I guess I thought he was just harmless and a bit lonely. Fast forward about a year. It's summer of 2013, and two of my best friends and I are caravanning to Wakarusa, a music festival that took place in Ozark, Kansas. It was about a 13-hour drive from Atlanta, but totally worth it. We went every year. An important note here is that this wasn't some small, intimate festival. It hosted upwards of 40,000 people, and it was often hard to keep track of my friends, let alone find people who I knew came separately. So my friends and I are on a blanket in the middle of a huge crowd, watching widespread panic. It's nighttime, so the only lights are coming from the stage and random LED toys or glow sticks or whatever. Out of nowhere, someone beelines for our blanket, makes himself at home next to me without permission, and strikes up a conversation. My group of friends is generally warm and accepting, and it wasn't unusual to make random friends at a big hippie fest like this, so we thought nothing of it at first. Probably just someone high on ecstasy and looking for a bit of company. It wasn't until he started referencing me and my Facebook personally that the alarm bells started going off. This was Eddie. I had honestly completely forgotten about him and his persistent messages, and in the darkness there was no way I could have recognized him. He was talking like we were old friends, and tried to follow us around all night. Once I subtly alerted the others about who he was, we made every excuse in the book to try to leave, go back to our campsite, and call it a night. He was painfully insistent on following us back there. Obviously, I didn't want him to know where I slept, so I tried to appease him by saying I was exhausted, but that we could try and meet up again tomorrow. Dumb, I know. I was just doing anything I could to get him away in the moment, and had no intention of actually following through. He finally left us alone after that, and we walked a long roundabout way to our campsite, just in case he had watched or tried to follow at a distance. The next day, I made an avid point to avoid the area where we ran into Eddie and discussed meeting up. The festival venue was so huge, I figured there was no way he'd find me again. I was beside a small stage in the back corner of the venue, hooping in the woods with my friends, when I noticed him out of the corner of my eye. He was standing beside a tree all alone, watching me with a weird smile. It reminded me of a proud dad watching his young daughter play, but with a way creepier and more sinister overtone. Still, He hadn't done or said anything explicitly creepy or threatening, but his presence was so unsettling that I grabbed my friends and we pretended that we had forgotten about a set that was starting, so we ran out of the wooded stage area. I remember hoping he didn't notice I had seen him. The festival ended the next day, and I was relieved to not see him again. Fast forward about another year. At this point I barely used Facebook, and had all but forgotten about Eddie. My friend that I went to the festival with was visiting from out of town that night, and we were going to get some drinks. He got to my house and we were catching up, and the subject of the festival came up. We started talking about Eddie, and how weird that whole situation was, but at this point it was less creepy and more of a strange memory. I told him Eddie used to message me all the time, but I had stopped opening them years ago. Naturally, my friend wanted to look through the messages, so I obliged. We began to scroll through them, and I realized just how dire of a mistake it may have been to not block him. He had started by asking me what shows I was going to, what part of Atlanta I lived in, not taking the hint that I clearly had no interest in responding at that point. Then, as the months went by, he was sending me links to tickets he had bought for me to shows in Atlanta, links to tickets he had bought for us to go together. There was one message asking where he could pick me up for a show that was 2 hours away in Athens, and that he couldn't wait to see me again. The messages continued to go on, but at this point I was so creeped out I immediately blocked him, finally, and closed the computer wide-eyed. What the actual fuck? He sounded like he was carrying on an entire relationship with me, without my consent. He never acknowledged the fact that I literally hadn't responded to or even seen a message from him in over a year. Shaken up, we decided to just go get a drink and stop thinking about this weirdo. We get to Edgewood, a popular bar district in my city, and walk to our favorite small bar to get a drink. As soon as we walk into the bar, my heart sinks to the pit of my stomach. To this day, this was the creepiest and most coincidental moment that's ever happened. I see Eddie sitting at the far end of the bar. His face lights up as soon as I walk in, and he motions me over. He says something along the lines of, "I can't believe it's you," and starts firing off questions about me, my life, what I've been up to. At this point, the darkest feeling washes over me. I just feel unsafe and exposed. Why is he here? He doesn't even live in Georgia. I quickly tell him I have to use the restroom, but I'll be back to the bar for a drink. I grab my friend, who's equally in shock, and we speed walk around the corner to the bathrooms and then past them. I'll be forever grateful that the door to the patio area was just past the bathrooms, so we got a head start. We get outside, hop the fence, and start running to my car. I glance behind us, and Eddie somehow figured out in those 15 seconds that we left, even though you can't see the bathrooms from where he was sitting. He was walking rapidly across a crosswalk in our direction, eyes on me. We book it to my car and get the hell out of Edgewood as quickly as we can. Shaken, I drive us around for about an hour, before eventually going home to make sure we weren't followed. As inconclusive as this whole thing was, that was the last time I ever saw Eddie, and I wonder if this was just a string of coincidences, or if it was more sinister. After all, he didn't even live in Georgia. Why was he at one of my favorite bars alone, the night I happened to go through all of his old messages? Had he somehow gotten a hold of my location via Facebook? I made sure all my location services were off when I checked my phone, so to this day I have no idea how he ended up there, or what his intentions were. I wrote out this story back in 2015 when it happened, because I wanted to remember the details. It was genuinely scary when it occurred. For as long as I can remember, I've been afraid of being watched by people in the woods or through the windows. Movies like The Stranger scared the crap out of me. One night, we were invited to a backyard fire at our good friend's home. He lives on one of the main drags in our city, and the house sits directly to the left of one of the city's main walking trails. They have a high fence along the side of the backyard adjacent to the trail, but at the rear of the garden, the fence is a waist-high chain-link jobby with a gate. Luckily for our friend Shane, his house also sits on a greenback. The property is very private with large trees and bushes just outside the back fence. In order to access the gate and the fence in the rear from the outside, you'd have to make your way through a lot of low shrubs and trees. It was nice. We felt safe there. Not that we live in a rough and tumble area, but we generally feel safe. A crowd of us were stood around the fire pit having a few brew and smoking a few tokes. All the guys grew up together, so we were reminiscing about our childhoods. The story of Dickie Tag came up. It's probably exactly what you think it is. Then again, maybe not. Young kids running around with their birds out, either tagging each other with their dickies or tagging each other's flailing wieners. The rules are still unclear. We had a solid buzz going and we were roaring, laughing, and crying from the belly laughs. It was a hilarious discussion, debating on who had actually played this perverted game. So there we are, all yelling about this Dickie Tag. Kendrick Lamar on bust and having a great time, when one of the girls, Mal, is trying to get the group's attention. This goes on for about 45 seconds to a minute, before anyone pays any heed. When we finally shut up and can hear her, she points to the back fence near the gate and says, "There's a person stood there." We all turn and look, and lo and behold, there's a random dude stood in the dark, jiggling at the fence. We shut off the tunes and Shane and Mitch walk towards him. They ask, "What's on the go, man?" My initial thought was maybe we were being too loud yelling about dicks. This is a family neighborhood after all. The stranger in the dark responds with, "I'm just a little bit lost." This is when the creepiness starts. Shane responds by asking him how he could possibly be lost. The path is 20 feet in the other direction. The stranger tells us he's a 10-year Army combat veteran and begins to walk away. He stops after 5 feet and looks back. Shane then yells at him, "What are you doing, man? You're watching us in the woods being a creep. Get the fuck out of here." The man walks a few more feet and turns and stares again. For a second time, Shane tells him to get away from the backyard. The stranger makes his way back onto the path and looks again. Shane and Mitch at this point both tell him to stop staring and get the hell out of here. They all but huss him down the path. At this point, we're all pretty creeped out. We have no idea how long this guy was stood there in the woods before Mel noticed him. The entire back of the house is woods, so we didn't know if the guy actually went on his way or if he looped back and was creeping around. The crowd is all having a discussion about what had transpired and beginning to relax again. The buddy was probably drunk anyways. We're known for our drink where I come from. Not 15 minutes later, along the side of the garden that's adjacent to the trail, I noticed someone walking down the path. I thought this was odd based on what just happened, as well as the time of night. The person walks along and looks in on us, then stops and approaches the fence. I yell out above the conversation that someone is by the fence again, so all 6 of the men present walk over. It was the same man again, but he had approached us from the opposite direction we had shot him in moments before. The guy starts by saying, "I was only joking, you guys." At this point, Shane had got a solid buzz on, and's not impressed that this creeper was back. Jaina, who's the level-headed one, also goes over to mediate the conversation. She finds out his name and that he's looking for directions to another main road in the city, located about 15 minutes north of where we were. He tells her again that he's a 10-year-old Army combat veteran. Between her and the men, they point the creeper in the right direction and he starts to walk. Still sketched out, one of the guys watches him and where he goes. Instead of going up the road as instructed, they watch him try and enter the private backyard of the house across the street. He gets yelled at again by Shane to go up the road and not onto someone's private property. There are a few choice words said. Buddy is in the middle of the busy road and almost gets struck by a truck, but he finally makes his way up the road. We watch until he's out of sight. Now we're sufficiently spooked. Chances are this guy was tweaking on drugs or having a mental breakdown. Either way, he was acting unpredictable. It wasn't sitting well with Mel, so she chose to alert the police, just to let them know that a potentially intoxicated man is causing minor disturbances. The police were exceptionally interested in Mel's call. They wanted to know exactly where we saw this guy, what he was wearing, and when we saw him last. 3 cruisers and a ghost car showed up within minutes. Mel and Jana took the bullet and went to talk to the police in person. They got asked a lot of questions, and of course provided all the detail they could. It was at this point Mel noticed the police dog. She asked if we should be worried. Is this guy a threat? She was told, no, you should be fine, by the officer, and that they were just trying to find him. We stay in the backyard and watch the police and the dog go down the path with flashlights. Another officer goes up the road on foot looking for the stranger. Eventually, the show dies down, and our crowd decides to Google the creeper's name and see if there's any news stories. The first hit is contact info for a person of the same name, who lives in the community the guys are from. The exact community we were laughing about talking about Dickie Tag. Kind of creepy. A total coincidence, but still spooky. The second hit is a story about a body that was found in the city's largest park about 5 years ago. There was no name in the story, but as we scrolled down to the comments, the creeper's name was there. He had written a comment on this story, and all it said was, "Rest in peace, Shane." We haven't seen anything in the news about what may have transpired with this man. I hope he's safe, and didn't hurt himself or anyone else. Either way, he scared the shit out of us, and gave us a great campfire tale for years to come. This story takes place when I was 12 years old, and my brother, Ryan, was 10. My brother and I had just come home from school. We didn't live very far from it, only about a 2-minute walk from it actually. Usually after school had finished, I would grab my backpack, and whatever I had for homework that night, put on my outdoor shoes and start to make my way over to my brother's classroom, where he would be patiently waiting for me to arrive so we could start our walk home together. The walk home was the same as usual. Whenever we walked home, we usually got there at about 3 p.m., and as we got home, we got a snack each, and something like a small bowl of chips, or some cookies and milk, and we would sit at the table to eat together. My mom was a hairdresser at the time, who worked from home because when she had us, she wanted to be there for us and spend a lot of time with us for a while, since she was a single mother and we couldn't afford a babysitter. She would usually finish work at around 4:30 or 5 p.m. most nights, sometimes longer, sometimes earlier depending on her day. My dad worked night shifts, so he was usually asleep during the day and then would be up for dinner. It was one of the days where my mom and dad were going to be going out to get groceries after my mom had just finished up with work. When the time came around, they both got ready to go. Since this was going to be the very first time my parents were going out for about a half an hour and leaving me to look after my brother, I felt very happy, and I felt like a big girl, since I really wanted to prove I could babysit Ryan. That way my parents could spend more time with one another and go out somewhere for dinners or dates whenever they wanted. My dad had sat Ryan and I down to remind us what to do and what not to do. Don't open the door for anyone. We have a key and we'll come through the garage, so it won't ever be us knocking, okay? If you need us for anything, call us right away. Don't wait until it's too late. We'll be gone a maximum of a half hour to get some quick groceries, etc. So after we got a hold of all the information we needed, they gave us our hugs and kisses and left. Brian and I went downstairs into the playroom. By the way, Ryan and I are very close, because we had to go through quite a lot together, and we're also very close in age. We were playing with Lego at the time, trying to build something that Ryan had gotten for his birthday that year. Ryan told me he would be back in a minute, as he was just going to get a drink or some more Lego. I told him okay and kept building and playing. 5 minutes later, though, I can't know what it was, but I suddenly got this weird feeling. I immediately stopped playing and listened in. I could hear my brother speaking. I frowned in confusion. Why would he be calling my parents, and for what? I got up and started making my way to the stairs. I peeked around the wall that led up to the main floor, where our front door, kitchen, and living room was. That's when my heart felt like it had stopped, and my face turned pale. Ryan was speaking to somebody, in the house. The front door was wide open, and a lady, maybe her 50s or so, was standing there in the doorway talking to him. She was actually taking her coat off and inching her way deeper into the house, asking my brother where my mom was, and other things that I can't quite remember. I ran up to him and asked him what the hell he was doing. I pulled him by his wrist and got him behind me. I couldn't get to the home phone that was in the kitchen because I didn't want to leave my brother unattended or leave that lady and not know where she was in our house. I couldn't get myself to talk to her. I was quite a shy kid, but I was frozen. I had no idea how to get this lady out of there. But then I remembered my mom telling me, one day, if someone asked where she was or where my dad was and wanted them, whether it was on the phone or in person, and neither of them were home, to just tell them they were taking a shower or something that indicated they were in the house. So that's what I did. "Where's your mom?" the lady asked in a weird tone. I got a chill, and then worked up enough courage to finally say, "Oh, she's almost done in the shower. She'll be out in a few minutes, actually." The lady stared at both Ryan and I for a moment, and all she did was say, "Oh." She didn't finish whatever she was about to say, because at that moment, someone came in the back door of my house. I turned my head and saw my older sister had just come in after finishing her work for the day. She noticed the woman in our house and ran straight up to us. I can't remember what was said, other than my sister threatening to call the police, but after that, the lady ended up leaving in quite the rush. I turned to Ryan and asked him why he would open the door. He told me he had forgotten that my parents had a key and wouldn't be coming through that way. He told me that the lady had kind of looked like my mom through the window. When my parents returned, my sister told them what had happened and that the lady had left after she had threatened her. My parents were a bit angry at the situation, but they were overall glad we were safe. It took them almost a year to let us stay alone again like that, but it was to make sure that the next time we did, nothing like this would ever happen again. I don't know what that woman's intentions were, and I don't want to know what they were either. My brother learned his lesson that day, not to open the door to anyone when we're alone ever again. This happened to me during my junior year of college. For context, I'm a 22-year-old female. I was driving from my hometown in the Chicago suburbs to the University of Missouri, which is about a 6-hour drive. I made the drive about every 4 to 6 weeks to see my family and my long-distance boyfriend. There are 2 main ways to take to the town my university is in. Stay on the interstate system through central Illinois and St. Louis, or branch out to back roads just after Springfield, Illinois, until picking the interstate back up about 30 minutes from my college. I usually like to take the back roads, simply because it kept me awake with the constant speed limit changes and the occasional towns I'd pass through. But this particular time, I took the interstate system because there was a high potential for winter weather. Here I was, minding my own business, listening to one true crime podcast episode after another, when about an hour from my exit, traffic came to a standstill. Great, I thought. It was already way beyond dark at that point. It was also a Sunday night, and I just wanted to get home and catch a decent night's sleep before my Monday classes. After a while, emergency vehicles flew past the traffic on the shoulder, indicating that there must be some sort of accident just up ahead. After what felt like forever, traffic slowly started crawling again, and eventually started moving a little as we all passed the incident. This is when it started. I will admit, I like to drive fast on the interstate, especially on this particular drive. I mean, what college kid doesn't? I was in the right lane with a decent amount of space between me and the car in front of me. That's when I noticed someone right on my bumper. Seriously? I muttered out loud. Traffic was no longer super heavy, and the person could have easily passed me in the left lane. Suddenly, the car began flashing their brights at me and honking. I was extremely confused. I turned off my podcast and kept a close eye on my rear view. The person continued to flash their brights, half blinding me in the darkness through my mirrors. "Asshole," I said, flooring it into the left lane. I maneuvered in and out of a few cars, attempting to get away from whatever issue this person had, except they followed my every move. Being a 21-year-old female, I began to get a sick feeling in my stomach. I had listened to enough true crime and general horror stories to be just the right amount of paranoid. I had read on social media recently about girls from my school encountering sex traffickers in my town and along the interstate that runs through it. One of the town's papers had even run a series of stories regarding multiple sex and human trafficking rings that used this interstate to traffic victims, specifically because it runs the length of the entire country. I shook the disturbing thought out of my head and continued doing about 85 in the right lane, unless I had to go around someone. The car continued to follow me though, flashing its lights and barely letting themselves ever get more than a few cars behind, or behind and beside me. Finally, I took the exit to my university. I looked back, and the car had followed this time as well. It seemed as though the person was trying to get me to pull over. Is there something wrong with my car that I can't see? I wondered silently. Even if there was no way in hell I was pulling over on the side of an interstate in the middle of a dark, rainy night. That's exactly how urban legends or teenage slasher movies start. At this point, though, I had no idea what to do. Looking back, I really should have driven straight to the local police station, but I was too flustered and scared to think straight. I tried to think back on the last hour or so of my drive. Did I cut anyone off? I didn't think so. I didn't think I had done anything to make any drivers around me this pissed. I'm a relatively good driver and tend to mind my own business on the road, not engaging in road rage or anything stupid like that. Stupidly, I began to drive to my apartment. The car followed the whole way, still flashing their lights every so often, but no longer honking behind me. They continued to stay glued to my bumper, though. I began to panic. What if they followed me all the way home? What the hell should I do? Call the police and send them on a wild goose chase to look for me and this car as I'm driving around town? As I approached another small exit off a local highway onto a smaller street that ran past campus and towards my apartment, I had an idea. As I got closer to the exit, I didn't get into the far right lane to turn off. At the very last second, though, I jerked the wheel and careened across the gravel shoulder, so close to the grass that I barely missed driving off the road. As I gunned it down the exit ramp, I glanced up at the overpass. The car had screeched to a halt and was honking its horn maniacally. I cried the rest of the way home, calling my boyfriend and explaining what had just happened. I never got a good enough look at the car to get a license plate number, or really even a good description of the vehicle, so I never reported the incident to police. And to this day, I have no idea what exactly it was that happened that night. My best guess is that whoever this person was, they saw me when we were all stopped on the interstate, waiting for the emergency vehicles to come clear the scene. It's very clear from the stickers I have on my car, one of my university's name and one that said Dog Mom, that I was likely a college-aged female. At this point, All this person had to do was end up next to me, see that I was a woman driving alone on the interstate in the middle of the night, and just have the wrong intentions. So, to the crazy person who followed me for an hour on the dark, rainy interstate, let's not meet. This happened last weekend. My state is still pretty much entirely in shutdown due to COVID. I'm working as an administrative assistant for an organization. I've been working here since I was 16, 18 now. The office where I work is almost completely empty all the time, and it's really eerie from how it was pre-pandemic. The building shares a lobby with a hotel that has little restaurants, shops, art galleries, etc. Pre-COVID, it was a really lively, happening place pretty much all around the clock. So now, most of the people in the offices are working from home, and the shops, for the most part, have either gone out of business or are currently closed. There's still one open coffee shop, but that's about it. So I usually work from home, but I needed the office space this time for things I had to get done. I went into the office around noon. It was pretty much a ghost town. Nobody else seemed to be in this huge building, and the only sound is the normal lobby music, echoing throughout the empty, lifeless building. I get in the elevator and go up to my office to begin work. However, I started to get this off feeling, just like not being alone in the office, and I got extremely creeped out. I kept checking around the office, but I couldn't find anything, so I just got back to work. It's around noon at this point, when I begin to hear footsteps in the hallway. Because of the new COVID rules, we have to sign in and out of the office in order to do contact tracing. I go into the front office to see if anyone had signed in after me, but no one had. I tell myself I'm just being paranoid, and I try to get back to work. So here I am, focused on my task again, when I hear a door softly close shut. My heart starts beating really heavily, and I go back to the front office. Still, no one else had signed in. I decided it was best for me to just leave right there and then. Maybe call my boss and ask him to come back with me to collect my stuff later. So I go down to the lobby, which is still eerie and empty. I call my boss and ask him what to do, because I had left my work laptop in there. My boss told me to do whatever is safest for me, and if there was a security guard on duty, to go find them and ask them to walk me out of the lobby to my car and alert them of the issue. I go to the security desk, and the guard there tells me he's been there all morning and has only seen me and one other person go in the elevators that day, but he didn't know what floor they got off on. I stay there with him for a while, and he sees a person get on the elevator at a floor below mine and leave. He tells me he thinks the noises I heard were probably just an echo from that person on the floor below me, but if I want, he'll go to the office with me. I tell him I'm fine, that it's all good. Fragile masculinity over here. I take a step back up to my office to begin working. As I'm starting to get settled in with my work, I again hear footsteps. I look down the hallway, but I can't see anybody. I decide it's not worth it for me to stay there. I was too freaked out. I grab my stuff and head out the door and make my way over to the elevators. It feels like an eternity just waiting for them to get there. Suddenly, I feel like someone is watching me again, and I turn to look towards the office entrance. The next thing that happened freaked me out so badly that at the time I just couldn't comprehend it. Lo and behold, I see a very tiny woman, maybe 5'2", who I didn't recognize at all, and I knew didn't work for the company. She was peeking through the glass of the office door, standing there totally naked. She makes eye contact with me, and runs back towards the office until she's out of view. I was stunned. It was the weirdest thing I've ever seen in my life. I jump in the elevator and press the lobby button, and shut the door as fast as I can. I go to the security guard and tell him what happened as well. He says it's impossible that anyone else was in there with me, because they always keep a log of people leaving and entering, which floor times, and no one else had entered my floor in 3 whole days except for my boss. I call my boss and tell him what happened, and he was sufficiently weirded out. Anyways, he, another coworker, and I decided to check out the office the next day together and find that someone had taken all the office snacks in the break room. We find in our relaxation office, the office for when people are having a bad day and need a place to relax, a pair of socks, a brush with lots of hair and dried flakes of blood on it, and a grocery bag filled with receipts, and other random junk like thumbtacks, rocks, a small dollar store plushie, even used Q-tips with earwax, but we could not find anyone in the office. Sorry, this is a long one. This happened a few years ago, but I still think about it to this day. I was on holiday in a city on the other side of the country, celebrating my 21st birthday with my best friend. We were having an amazing night out, with a few too many drinks, and ended up meeting 2 guys. Let's call them Andrew and Billy. They seemed like really cool guys, and we were into them. So when they asked us back to their hotel room, we said yes. Obviously a silly idea, but we were very young and very drunk. And things were great on the way back to the hotel room. We were all laughing and having a great time in general. When we got to the room, though, there were 2 other men there as well. Let's call them Ricky and JD, who were at least 10 to 15 years older than us. They gave us really creepy vibes, but we tried to brush it off. We asked Andrew and Billy just who these guys were, and they said that they were their colleagues, as they were in the city for work, and the company had paid for their rooms. Andrew and Billy were in different rooms, but we were all partying in Andrew's room that he shared with Ricky. I got too drunk, and my friend put me to bed. She said that she was going to Billy's room, and asked if I would be okay with Andrew. I said yes. And keep in mind, my friend didn't have a phone either, so we basically had no way of getting in contact with each other. Another extremely stupid thing, I know. I'd been in the bed for a while with Andrew, just talking and chilling when he suddenly says, "I just have to pop out real quick. I'll be right back." I assumed he meant just out of the bedroom, not out of the actual hotel room. But he left to get something from Billy's room. Anyways, I was just watching TV in the bed when the bedroom door burst open. I assumed it was Andrew, but my heart sank when I saw that it was Ricky, the weird colleague. He walked into the room and sat on the bed. Keep in mind, I'm very naked at this point, trying to cover myself up with the blanket. You do realize that everyone's left you alone in here, right? It's just you all alone. No one's here, and no one can hear you. He continued edging closer and closer to me on the bed. At this point, I was completely speechless and terrified. I was completely frozen in fear, and I had no idea what to do. I tried to say something, but nothing would come out. He definitely sensed my fear, but for some reason he just got up and left. A sense of relief flooded over me, and I felt a bit silly for overreacting. That was until I heard JD, the other random colleague, shouting, "Get the fuck back in there! What are you doing? This isn't what we discussed. Get back in there and do what you were meant to do. Who gives a fuck about that whore? Just get back in there and do what you need to." I ran to the bathroom and locked myself in because I was so scared, but there was no way out, and the only way to get out of the hotel room was through the front door. I would have to walk right past Ricky and JD to get there. As I sat there terrified, I had a million thoughts rushing through my head, and I had no idea what to do. I knew, though, that I had to escape. I decided my only option was to just leave the room and be ready to defend myself if things were to go pear-shaped. I threw my clothes on and grabbed my shoes. I opened the door, and Ricky and JD were sitting on a couch close to the bedroom door. JD said, "Hey, sexy, where are you going in such a rush? Come and join us. Come on, come here right now." No thanks. I ran to the front door and ripped it open. When I got out, I was so relieved, but I was still in a random hotel in a random city with no way to contact my friend. I thought the best option was to go down to the lobby and just wait. As I was walking, though, I heard the two men yelling down the hall. "Where are you? We know you aren't too far away. Come back and join us. You know you want to." It was Ricky and JD. I was absolutely terrified by this point. I started sprinting to the elevator, and I could hear them sprinting right behind me. I never knew I could run so fast, but I just continued and never looked back. I felt like I was running forever until I reached the end of the corridor, and my worst nightmare had come true. I missed the turn off of the elevator. Fucking idiot. This meant I had to turn around and run back towards where I could hear their voices, still yelling down the hallway. I found the elevator and hopped in, but I could hear their voices getting louder and louder. I didn't want to imagine what would happen if they got into that elevator with me. The door finally closed after what felt like a lifetime. I thought I would go down to the lobby and just wait there, because at least there would be people there, so there would be some form of safety. I got to the lobby, though, and realized that there was no one in sight. No one at all, not even behind the desk. I sat down on a couch and didn't know what to do with myself. I was absolutely terrified that Ricky and JD would come down to the lobby after me. I heard the elevator door ding and open up. My heart stopped, but thankfully it was Andrew. I told him what had happened. He was outraged that his colleagues had done that, and he took me immediately to where my best friend was. Everything turned out fine in the end, thankfully, but it could have been a lot worse.